What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. As always, I'm your host, Alex Petikov. I hope everyone is having a great Monday night so far. It's awesome to be back with you all, of course. For folks that might be watching this after the fact or just tuning in, this is a live stream show that we do every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Talk to lots of different researchers, Bigfoot, mostly Bigfoot stuff. We do some other cryptid stuff occasionally, but Bigfoot is obviously thing that's on everyone's brain. So that's what we like to talk about mostly. We have quite a few shows. This is show 77. So we're getting up there in numbers. There's a ton of awesome interviews we've done in the past. Last week, we had a fun time talking to Seth and Eli Watson and Heather Moser about some of the upcoming Small Town Monsters Bigfoot related projects. So we talked about Beyond the Trail, Rocky Mountain Sasquatch. That came out a couple weeks ago. Go check that out. That's over on the Small Town Monsters channel. Bigfoot Project is coming up next week, as well as On the Trail Bigfoot, the Discovery. So I know we mentioned in the show that it was actually going to be coming out last week, but there was a little bit of a mishap with the distributor. So they kind of switched the date and nobody really knew. So we had basically told everyone it was going to be coming out right after the show, and it ended up that wasn't the case. So we will be out November 16th. So not that far. I think that is next week, actually. So you can look forward to that next week. So for the next few episodes, we have some very interesting guests coming on. Next Monday, we'll be doing kind of the regular show. We'll have on actually Michael Mays, and we're going to be talking about big cats as well as Bigfoot. He's a member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, like our guest tonight. So it'll be really fun, kind of back-to-back NAWAC conversations. But this Sunday, this may not be a live interview, so I'm actually going to have on Gareth Paterson, who is a animal researcher out of Africa, South Africa specifically. And, that's some place where I was born in South Africa. So I always wanted to talk about some of the mystery hominid sightings down there. Now, they're having a lot of power outage issues in South Africa. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do the interview live. It was supposed to be Sunday at noon to kind of accommodate the South African time difference, obviously being 6 hours ahead. Would be 6 p.m. over there if we did it at noon on Sunday East Coast time. But he's saying we might not be able to do it because of the power outage issue. So it might be a pre-recorded interview. I haven't really done that yet with this program. So bear with me. Either way, I'll make an announcement on the channel, but it's going to be super awesome. Gareth is awesome. And our guest tonight as well, he's aware of Gareth and some of the stuff he's done, with other animals, but then he's also researched the Otang, kind of South Africa's version of Bigfoot, which I think is pretty fascinating. So it'll definitely be something to talk to Gareth, actually. But for tonight's guest, we're really excited to have on Matt Pruitt. So I see there's a lot of comments already, people saying this is going to be a great show. People are familiar with Matt, of course. He is basically a researcher, and he has been actively pursuing a resolution to the Bigfoot or Sasquatch conundrum for nearly 2 decades. He's an avid field researcher, as well as a public speaker, and has appeared on various media outlets and platforms to discuss the mystery ape phenomenon. Matt is also the producer and editor of Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo. Cliff and Bobo's podcast, really awesome. If you guys haven't seen that show, it's fantastic. Or listen to it. You can't watch it, but it's a great show. Who doesn't like Cliff and Bobo and some of the guests they have on? And Matt is also the producer and co-host of the Apes Among Us, the official podcast of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. So really excited to talk about basically all the stuff we just mentioned and whatever else comes up. So without further ado, let's bring Matt in here. What is going on, man?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Pleasure to have you on here finally.
Excellent. Well, it's good to finally get to chat with you. I guess we met in 2018 at Squatchachusetts, right?
Yeah, I think briefly, I'd shown up for kind of, they did their event there with yourself and Cliff, and I remember you spoke right before Cliff, and they were both super interesting presentations. That was the first time I ever heard Cliff give a talk about the hands, the kind of the handprints and the difference, the possible kind of 6th or 5th digit rather. So it was kind of really interesting. I just remember that event. But yeah, it was sort of brief. And, I know you meet people at events like for a minute, and then some people expect you to know years later, like, oh, you remember I met that one time? It's like, met a lot of people. So I get it can be tough like that. But definitely nice to make your acquaintance this way.
Certainly. Yeah, that was a fun event. The organizer, Jonathan Wilk, is a very good friend, one of the most generous people and
Oh,
very kind and
seriously.
friendly. So that's been my one and only trip to Massachusetts, unfortunately. So I'd love to get back up there sometime, but it was a great trip for sure.
Yeah, we've been talking before the show about you're trying to get up to the White Mountains, kind of a bucket list. And whenever you're up here, be happy to show you around. And there's definitely a good amount of Bigfoot history up here. As people on this show will know, I've had a lot of New Hampshire people on, and I actually did a weekend event over in Maine this weekend, the Floridian Fest. And shout out to all, I met a couple people that actually were familiar with the show out there. So awesome to see you guys. Got some new reports out of New Hampshire and a really cool snowmobiling sighting up in Maine. A guy was snowmobiling with 13 people, and they saw a Bigfoot cross in front of where they have the logging roads, kind of right where the trees part. They saw it cross. They did a noise at it and it whooped back at them and kept going down in the woods. And there's like 13 snowmobiling dudes, and they're like, "What the heck?" And the area was near Jackman, Maine, which is totally insanely remote. I've camped up there. Beautiful area. So a lot of cool stuff. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff up here. So we'll definitely have to get you up here. But enough about that. Let's get right into kind of the basics before we really kick off the conversation. What got you interested in Bigfoot? The question I'm sure that everyone likes to ask. And, it's good to hear where people are coming from in this topic.
Oh, certainly. Well, I grew up in Southern Appalachia and Northeast Georgia. Like many people, I had an experience when I was young. It
Oh,
actually
right
happened when
on.
I was 17 years old. Didn't see the things, but myself and a group of friends we were trying to find this abandoned cabin. It was supposedly on the side of this mountain where a lot of scary things had happened. It sort of had a local reputation for being like a haunted place, essentially. So we made this sort of like haphazard plan to camp and go locate this cabin in the dark and try to stay overnight there. And heard these things, very loud, heavy sounding things that seemed to be like paralleling us in the dark. And there's just like five of us with mag lights, flashlights, just scared, and everything from like loud branch breaking and hearing branches being ripped from trees, and then what sounded like them being struck against trees. And this was
Right.
1999, and so I'd never encountered any stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch or heard of wood knocking or anything like that. And so, long story short, it scared the hell out of us, and we abandoned the place and didn't come back until the next day to get our tents and everything. But it took a while before I even considered the notion of Bigfoot. And in fact, like I remember clearly stumbling on Sasquatch related information online and like laughing as I read through, to be specific, it was the BFRO's website, which was one of the only like prominent Bigfoot websites. And
Right.
this would have been in like 2001, 2002,
Early days of the internet. Yeah.
a couple of years after that first experience. And I can't remember if it was like there was an FAQ, and it might have changed since that time. It's probably still up there now, but like there were these descriptions, like generalized descriptions of behavior and
Right.
appearance. I just remember thinking like how preposterous. But then as I was digging into other encounter reports, uh, some of the things that people described were so similar to what we experienced. And then hearing recordings of wood knocks, and we heard these vocalization sounds that included whoops and these kind of loud
Ah,
moaning howls. And so uh, hearing those and comparing those with one of my friends actually had a camcorder with him, so we got some of those sounds recorded. There wasn't a lot of like visual to be had because this was like a big VHS-C camcorder,
mm,
late 90s kind of a thing. But being able to compare those purported Sasquatch sounds or sounds that were attributed to Sasquatches and what we heard, it was like that's what initially set the hook. But it was still like a process of, okay, well, if this is a Northwestern phenomenon primarily, then, this is Northeast Georgia, where's the connection there? And so the way I usually describe it to people is like I started sort of like peeling back these different things, thinking that I would get to that proverbial dead end and I could drop it. And so it's been like 20 years and I'm still looking for that dead end. I haven't fundamentally answered the question, let's say, about, what gives rise to those experiences. But um, seeing that there was so much history in the Appalachians and in terms of people like observation and encounter reports and testimonies, going back as far back in time as you could find the printed word, et cetera, and then meeting local witnesses myself. That's sort of how I got started investigating. It was finding other people in that region that had seen things or heard things, and then diving into the books, et cetera. And that just grew and grew to being in the field. And again, here it is all these years later, and I'm still trying to figure it out, but trying to enjoy it as much as I can along the way too. So
And that's awesome. I mean, I'm sure it was probably quite an experience actually hearing about the amount of stuff that North Georgia for years has sort of been kind of known as a spot where there's a lot of sightings, a lot of activity, so-called a couple tracks I remember seeing, I think from early 2000s, in Cliff's database from kind of that area. So, and I
Well, I
know
mean,
their first episode of the show, right, of Finding Bigfoot was North Georgia, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, I was the guy who brought him there,
Right.
because I put all that together. So I would like to think that I've contributed in some small way to that, which is really funny because like when I first got involved and was doing, my own sort of research and investigation, let's say, it was just trying to like satisfy my own curiosity, which
Sure.
I've now learned is like pretty insatiable about this subject because I've been thinking about it nonstop for like 20 years. Um, but at the time, that's really what I was trying to do. I wasn't really trying to like pursue proving it to anyone else, let's say, like to the broader society or the broader world or something. I just wanted to figure it out for myself so I could have some resolution or closure. Also because it was wildly interesting. And so there was really, at that time, there almost were, I think, no investigators really in the southeastern US. And so
Wow.
there weren't people that were collecting and disseminating reports. I mean,
Right.
obviously, people were having observations, but those weren't being like aggregated and disseminated in books or online or in print media articles, really.
There was no John
Um,
Green down there or something. Yeah.
exactly. And so it took quite a while. In fact, it was a number of years before I even found someone else who was pursuing it the same
Hmm.
way that I was. Like there might be people who were interested or people that had again sightings or experiences, or at least claimed to have sightings or experiences. But it took quite a while to sort of put all that together. And I remember it's like it's funny to think back about now, but I was trying to get the word out there. Like my dad was the small town doctor in the area where I grew up, so he knew a lot of people. So I would meet witnesses through him because he would know people who were avid hunters and outdoorsmen, and people who worked in professions where they would be out in the right
Yeah.
environments all the time. But I was still trying to get the word out there, so I had these business cards printed up, like with my name and phone number and like a little Bigfoot thing, and like if you've seen or heard something, I'd love to speak to you. And I would go to these places. There's one place that comes to mind in particular that's right where the AT crosses
Oh,
a
nice.
highway over this mountain. And so all the through hikers, it's one of the first stops and like overnight stops for through hikers. And I remember they laughed at me and they wouldn't even like put the card up in their little, they had a, like, they could, no, not everyone could just put a card up there. You had to hand it to them. They'd open this
There
case
was,
and put it
yeah,
in
one of
there.
those things, right?
And now, like, so, years later, I got to work on Finding Bigfoot, and I put together this info packet because I was in the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization at the time, and that got pitched, and it was one of the first episodes to get the green light, and we produced it, and it became the premiere episode. And that same store now, all their branding is Sasquatch related, so it's in their logos and their T-shirts, hats, magnets, stickers, and of course, like I bought some of that stuff. But the last
Like,
time
this
I
is
was in
here
there,
because of me.
yeah, the last time I was in there, I saw that stuff, and I was thinking that, like, yeah, man, that's so funny that the idea in the early 2000s was like laughable, and now it's like profitable. But there's no telling, and I'm sure that that's why they're doing it, right? They're not doing it because they've had some paradigm shift of the potential
Right.
reality of these apes. They've seen that there's like a monetary value, so fair enough.
The
But
interest is there. Absolutely.
the interest is there because otherwise there wouldn't be a monetary value because people are interested in like buying that and like representing that iconography in some way as sort of like a outward manifestation of like, hey, this is what I'm interested in. So I'd love to hear the sort of conversations that happen there now, if people come through and tell their stories and things like
Yeah,
that.
if
But it
people
is
feel more
nice to
safe
see.
about telling their stories, yeah.
Yeah, it is nice to see that the cultural awareness in North Georgia and many other places has grown as a big part consequence of that show.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, since doing Beyond the Trail, I mean, I've been going squatching to a lot of different places. Obviously, New England has been a big focus, and the culture here, I think, is still lacking as in other places where there's still that reserved attitude, but you see it year after year more and more. Like you said, the Bigfoot on the local state park stickers or symbols or whatever, they'll have a patty or they'll have something along those lines. But time and time again, I hear, after Finding Bigfoot, that's when people started coming forward. So you do have on that one hand, the kind of people realize the monetary value of it, but it also creates an atmosphere where people say, well, hey, I mean, I've encountered this quite a few times where people around here saw Bigfoot, had an experience 30, 40 years ago plus, didn't know what it was, didn't think it was Bigfoot, thought it was a monster or, had some local moniker. And then it was until after the internet and things like Finding Bigfoot or Monster Quest, that's the other one I hear a lot about, is that people say, that's when I realized, well, maybe this was a Sasquatch. I mean, one of the guys in the chat here, Brian and Chewy, he's a hiker buddy. I've had him on the show. He had an encounter in the early 2000s in the White Mountains with something that kind of rubbed up against his tent and made a guttural noise that he could hear. And it wasn't until hearing John Mayanzinski's encounter that he kind of thought, well, maybe that was very similar. So it's interesting how these things, because people love to complain about, Finding Bigfoot or whatever shows or documentaries. But then on the other hand, I love seeing the people that kind of feel more comfortable with coming out with those stories. So it's really cool to hear that. And that I can just imagine for you going to that area now and seeing all the Bigfoot stuff. And like, I was the Bigfoot hipster. I was doing it before it was cool, right?
For sure. Well, I think a lot of it is about like what we're permitted to talk about by our society.
Sure.
People are wildly interested in all sorts of things that, might have some like perception of being forbidden or taboo or fringe or something like that.
Weird,
so it's really interesting. Like I've followed a bit of the UFO news over the last couple of years. I'm not a student of the UFO thing. I really don't know much about it, but I'm interested in it enough that like I'll entertain myself with like podcasts or documentaries here and there. Probably the same way like most outsiders entertain themselves with Bigfoot stuff. It's like, that's interesting to think about, and then they go about their thing. But it is interesting to see that like once you have these like very trusted institutions like the New York Times and then the Pentagon, et cetera, like these big powerhouse institutions that we trust say that we think there's something to this. It's okay to discuss. It's like, well, the discussion never really changed. It just came out in
was open, legitimized, right?
Out of the shadows, like this particular podcast, and so it's like the dialogue's always been there. People have always been wildly curious about it and have been pursuing it. And so, and even the nature of the data hasn't changed. It's not like the second the government says it's okay to talk about this because there is something here, that all of a sudden it retcons the last X amount of decades of things.
Right.
And so I think the same hopefully will be true of the Sasquatch one day, is that, and you see that it happens in increments of progress, I think. And so shows like Monster Quest and like Finding Bigfoot make it permissible to talk about in an open dialogue, so communities. I mean, it was kind of a culture shock to me when I moved from Georgia to Washington, because in the Pacific Northwest, it's so woven into the social culture,
right?
The fabric of like the social consciousness. People talk about Bigfoot very openly.
Bigfoot Java, there's murals everywhere.
Yeah, well, people would talk about their experiences readily. It was kind of like pulling teeth to get experiences out of people in Georgia in the first few years. So usually I had to like earn their trust. And also I started that when I was really young. Like I started interviewing people when I was like 20, and most of the people were older. And so it was like, what is this kid, bothering me with, blah, 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 blah. So it wasn't like I was getting inundated with reports for those first few years, but when I lived in the Northwest, I lived in Seattle, but, I'd spend all my time in the Cascades and the Olympics and go down to Oregon and stuff. But I worked in a retail business, and, most customers, you start like, shooting the breeze about what, and you find out someone's a fisherman or a hunter or whatever. And like, I could get so many stories out of people, or if they hadn't had, a personal encounter or experience or sighting, then they knew someone who did. And it's funny because like even some like well-known witnesses that I had seen in documentaries from the 90s were customers of that particular store. And so they'd come in and I'd like, I know who you are, and will you tell my coworkers your story? And it was never like a contentious sort of thing. And it wasn't frowned upon. It was just very culturally a little bit different. So now it looks like that's sort of spreading, because of Finding Bigfoot.
Oh yeah. And I mean, it's interesting you say, it's like, it's almost like it's pushing sort of the Overton window in terms of Bigfoot as a conversation. The shows like that, or certain pieces of evidence that maybe come along, things that capture an audience, shift the needle a little bit more, because the UFO analogy is perfect. Just seeing how that's transformed. I mean, 10 years ago, people that are into UFOs were, oh, you're like the kooky guy in the X-Files with the tinfoil, right? Now, I mean, it's completely mainstream. Everyone's, when society starts making memes about something in such a large scale, that probably means that they've accepted it in some term. And, you remember Storm Area 51 and everything that kind of went along with that, just really cemented the phenomenon. So I think hopefully once we get to that stage in Bigfoot, I hope that, that's kind of a goal of mine with this podcast, is just to create dialogue. And so if people stumble across this, they can say, well, it's not all, crazy tin pot kind of people that are into this. There's totally normal, adjusted people into Bigfoot. And because, as you mentioned, there are so many people that do have an interest in this. And I meet people all the time who, they don't want to be associated with like the Bigfoot kind of community, and often for good reason. So I hope that, there's plenty of groups, obviously, like NAWAC and other podcasts and things like that, that are really kind of trying to push that scientific envelope a little bit. And I think I really appreciate what you do in terms of your research. And I think your approach has been pretty great. And I will get into a little bit more on that in a second. I did just want to take a second and say hey to some of the folks in the chat. See, there's already some questions coming in. We got Jeremiah, Bigfoot Society. Go check Jeremiah out. He's doing a very similar thing, talking to a lot of really great people, and just trying to kind of promote the topic and some of the great research that's being done. What's up, Bigfoot Anon? Obviously, we got Brian and Chewy. What's going on? Lots of great people. Beelin. This should be a very good and informative show. Yeah, absolutely. Got my buddy New Hampshire Sasquatch. What is going on, man? Awesome researcher. Ed Fan, should be a good interview. Yeah, there's a ton of people in the chat. We also has that host. Tate says this host has tiny feet. Okay. All right, Tate. Interesting. Jonathan Dodd, what is going on? Jonathan does some awesome illustrations about Bigfoot and everything associated. Peggy Curtis, I am so jazzed to hear Matt Pruitt. He's always so interesting and eloquent. Absolutely. Hey to everyone else as well. So we'll get to your guys' questions in a little bit. There's some great ones coming in. But so let's say I just approach you for the first time. I heard you're into Bigfoot. Like, so what's with this Bigfoot thing? How would you explain that in kind of layman's terms? Not necessarily try to sway me, but explain what Bigfoot might be in a sort of scientific or fashion that might lead me to want to actually look into it. If I'm putting you on the spot, basically.
Yeah, well, I guess it would depend on how much time I have allotted, because it's just, I mean, obviously there's no conversation wherein which you could prove that the Sasquatch is real. Obviously, I mean, we as a society, we as humans, we don't know that they exist. There are individuals who have claimed personal discovery and who have that knowledge, but we as humankind, we don't know that they exist, right?
Sure.
So I've realized that there's no conversation where you convince people that they do exist. And so essentially what I try to aim at is saying, like, well, there's this phenomenon exists, and it's really multiple phenomena, but to couch them all into like the Sasquatch phenomenon or the Bigfoot phenomenon, it's made up of a host of different things, like testimonial claims and physical traces and elements that are sort of like offered or interpreted as evidence. But essentially, something's at the bottom of that phenomenon. Like, nobody could say that the claims don't exist, or that the people making the claims don't exist. Obviously they do. And these bits of, physical items, traces, elements, etc., touted as evidence, those things exist. And so what gives rise to it? Well, you can sift through a whole host of things, right? Like, there are plenty of things that are misidentifications, wherein someone is being sincerely wrong or like authentically misidentifying something, right? So they're not necessarily lying, and they're certainly not delusional. They just, someone tells you they saw a dark thing at 250 yards away at dusk behind dense brush. Well, they probably did, and it probably wasn't a Sasquatch, right? It was probably something else. But when you get down to the bedrock of the claims and evidence, the things for which there is no room for misinterpretation whatsoever, then you're left with two options. Either they saw what they said they saw, in which case, like, there's an external thing, a biological thing, or it's some production of the human mind. And so you could apply that to all the best claims and the best evidence. There's either a biological animal at the source of it, or it's a production of the human mind. There's really no like intermediary state that those can occupy. And so to me, it's like I'm trying to pursue the biological potential there. I do think that of those two hypotheticals, let's say the two hypothetical models, that the biological model is actually the more parsimonious one. It's the simpler one, and we can get into all that. I think that to say that it's all the production of the human mind, especially when we get into certain particulars, it requires a lot more complexity for that to be like a sufficient explanatory mechanism. So what I'm doing, at least what I'm trying to do, is to test that biological hypothesis, and so that requires, in a lot of ways, like behaving as if that's true. If you're trying to observe an animal in the environment, you don't know that the animal exists, right? Like, we don't know whether it's there to be observed or not. But if you're testing that hypothesis, you have to conduct your test in such a way that that possibility might manifest itself to you. And I don't mean that like it might actually occur. I don't mean manifest in terms of like some new agey spiritual thing. I mean that might actually happen. So testing that hypothesis requires that you conduct yourself as if the Sasquatches are real. And so I've not seen one out of all these years of trying in the field for many years. So I can't sit here and say that like definitively I've answered that question for myself. But in a nutshell, I would say that like the way to try to draw people into that, let's say, because a lot of people see fence sitters and they just want to knock them off the fence or hit them over the head with something, and it's like, no, we want those people to be drawn to some degree into like whatever's occurring here. You know what I mean? So to me, the way to do that is to show that like you have these competing hypotheses. The phenomenon exists. There's competing hypotheses of what could give rise to that. They both need to be investigated. The pursuit is necessary. The resolution to that Sasquatch problem, like what gives rise to the phenomenon, I think is necessary, because if there is no such animal and it is all the production of the human mind, it's like, well, why this manifestation? Why aren't these other things as sturdy or as long lasting? And why is it only triggered in these certain environments, and yet people are devoting their lives and time and resources to it? And so it does need a resolution, in my opinion. But that might be more of a long-winded answer that you were looking for. But yeah, I think that the biological answer is the more parsimonious of the two. Obviously, some sort of ape seems to fit the general descriptions. If you take all the commonalities between what people are describing, you try to categorize the animal based on those descriptions, you're left with an ape, a hominoid. I think there are animals in the fossil record that approximate that, or at least as a ancestral origin point, etc. So it's definitely worth pursuing, in my opinion. There's enough there that's compelling, and again, that make for a simpler argument than the production of the human mind. If you're building scaffolding, let's say, to build this foundation of your argument, you don't have to build that much scaffolding to explain the Sasquatch as a biological animal, versus as like a production of the human mind, it requires quite a lot.
Amazingly put. And the reason why I kind of put you on the spot like that is I've had quite a few people message me saying, oh, he's one of the smartest people in the Bigfoot field right now. He's the best Bigfooter out there. So definitely, I mean, I think you're very well spoken. Of course, that was amazing. And I can't help but agree. And the point about, I often hear that a lot, is this idea that, we're projecting some sort of especially as technology encroaches and our world is getting less and less connected with nature, we're sort of projecting this wild image of ourselves out in the wilderness. It's free, right? It's not chained down by modernity. That's something I've heard a little bit. I think that's supremely interesting as well. I mean, if you were to completely discount, the biological possibilities, which I think is foolish, that in itself would be interesting, why we have a need for something like that as a society, and has that always been there? And, I just think that's also something worthy, because I hear people often say, well, why even waste your time with anything like this? And I say, well, no, I mean, either of those are extremely interesting. Obviously, I think one is probably makes more sense. And as you said, kind of Occam's razor. I mean, I often tell people, you have these experiences or these people talking about things they've had happen. And when it comes to eyewitnesses, I know how a lot of researchers feel about the usefulness of eyewitness reports, right? Largely, kind of an individual report is an individual report. Unless you can get out to the scene really quickly and maybe find some secondary evidence, it's tough. But when it comes to the mass of data, do you start seeing consistencies, behavioral patterns, things that species might do? That's what gets really interesting when you start putting the sightings together. And I just don't understand. Some people just aren't into it, but I don't understand how you couldn't be fascinated by something as interesting as a creature very similar to us or very different, just living almost side by side by us. If that's the case, if that is what's happening, I mean, that's mind blowing. And I don't get, they do those surveys where they say a certain percentage of the population believes in Sasquatch or whatever. And, you wonder how many more are interested in the topic around that, the numbers. So it's probably a minority of society, but I don't know. I think we have our little niche here, and I think it's really interesting. And hopefully once we do move that needle a little bit more towards Sasquatch as a possibility, we'll have more people interested, and the interest seems to be growing and growing. Is that something you've noticed as well? I mean, aside from finding Bigfoot, just kind of the explosion in people just interested in kind of Sasquatch literature or stuff like that, or trying to look into the more scientific side of things? Or is the narrative, as some people think, has been lost kind of into the wooiness and the paranormal stuff?
I do think that there's some of that going on. I mean, to the earlier point about, what do we project out into the wild? We do that anyway. We do that on the things that are very real, like very real phenomenon. So even if the Sasquatch does exist as a biological species, there's still this cultural, psychological phenomenon going on around it. And especially as long as it remains sort of like shrouded in the realm of the unknown, we will continue to like project our own images onto the thing in terms of like how we interpret it. When you make contact with the unknown, your first pass approximation to try to like suss out what that is, you start generating these ideas, these, we could call them hypotheses, but they're really like fantasies because they're imaginative productions, let's say. And you sort of cast that, you drape it onto the unknown phenomenon, and then you see like, oh, that's what that thing is. And so people do that all the time with very well-known, well-understood phenomena, let alone unknown phenomena, right? So even if we do demonstrate that there is a biological species at the core of the Sasquatch phenomenon, the psychological phenomenon still exists. It's almost like the ape is somehow like nested within the cultural like sarcophagus or the productions around it. And so I think we'll see that. That's why it's like, is it nature or culture? Well, it's kind of both, potentially both. Like we don't know for sure that it's nature yet, right? We haven't demonstrated conclusively that these things exist, but definitely the cultural phenomenon is real. And I've seen that shift tremendously. In terms of are more people encountering the literature, I wish that were so. It seems like more people are encountering other people, and there's an exchange of like stories and experiences, which there's always a value in that. But what we're aiming at, we as in, I think like Sasquatch proponents or Sasquatch researchers, or whatever terminology, however you want to put us under like a single rubric, which there's really not, right? Like the Bigfoot community, everyone knows, is anything but communal for the most part, because you take people that agree on something and they'll find that one thing about that something that they don't agree on, and they'll immediately butt heads over it. And so there's a lot of infighting, unfortunately, among people who pursue the Sasquatch, and so it's really not that communal. But what Sasquatch proponents essentially want is to have like the reality of the thing or the validity of the thing recognized again by like the aforementioned institutions, whether that's scientific, academic, governmental, all the above. But unfortunately, like, they operate by a set of standards. And you could say that they have like a value hierarchy, a value structure that they abide by that's like mutually agreed upon. And a lot of that would be predicated in the realm of biology on physical evidence in the form of specimens. I think what we tend to do, and we do this all the time, I mean, we all do this, is that we sort of get together with people who have similar interests, and then we sort of erect our own value structures within that group, right? So like I might be a nerd for a certain band that was like a part of my teenage years, right? And like many people wouldn't care about them, but if like a signed guitar pick of that guitar player came up online, I might go like, oh cow, I'd spend like $500 for that. Whereas someone else would be like, dude, that's not worth 10 cents, So like the value is agreed upon with those people that kind of mutually agree on where the value of that is shared or stored.
So like something that might pass, let's say, in say the Sasquatch community, something that passes as an experience doesn't usually pass the smell test kind of outside of the community in terms of what I consider an experience or something like that.
I mean, even within the community very often, because obviously, there are people that take, hundreds of photographs of the natural world, and, we've all seen the dreaded red circles, and then they might have had an experience that was deeply associated with that, where they actually saw something, or they heard something, or something that gave that experience some validity to them. But then they try to impose that. It would be like me taking that guitar pick outside of that circle and trying to sell it for $1,000 or whatever. The analogy I always use, and I feel like I've picked on these people too much, is stamp collectors. Because like I wouldn't pay more than like 10 cents for a stamp or whatever, but there are people who would pay thousands or maybe tens of thousands of dollars for rare stamps. And so it's like, hey, no one's going to buy this if they're not a stamp collector, right? And so there are these subsets of people within, Bigfootery or Sasquatchery, let's say, who do have these value structures set around stick structures or
Right.
around like certain kinds of stories and things like that. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, because they can discuss that and come to some sort of conclusion amongst themselves. But it's when they take it out of that system and they try to impose it somewhere else and expect it to have that same value. And that's not just like science and academia, that's even within the Bigfoot community, because there are plenty of people who follow the subject that might be, staunch cynics, or some of which are just total skeptics, or the other way around, might be staunch skeptics, some of which are total cynics, and just like nothing really passes the muster test. And then these people will come to them with, like an X formation or whatever, and say like, this is evidence or this is proof. And
Right.
like, you've failed to define, your expectations to the point that like all you're doing is setting yourself up for headache and heartache time and time and time again. So that's what I've seen grow a lot, is that people have like kind of lost the connection to, I think, the best writing on the subject, the Sasquatch literature, let's say the John Green, Bindernagel, Krantz, Meldrum, etc., because that stuff it's not easy. Some of it's fairly technical, some of it is lighter reading, but some of it's fairly technical and difficult and requires like a certain amount of like diligence to learn about, okay, what do these things mean on a technical sense, and what sort of like in evolutionary biological terms, ecological terms, anthropological terms, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
And so people are more apt these days to sort of build these little silos wherein they can set up their own value structures and pat themselves on the back. And again, we all do that, whether that's with, again, some pop culture thing that we're interested in, whatever it is that we nerd out about, right?
Sure.
But I think most of us know that like we couldn't take it outside of that and impose that value somewhere else. Whereas unfortunately, like most of the community, I think they really want to be validated by,
of course,
science, by like capital S science, big science. That's why they call themselves researchers, and they call what they find evidence, even sometimes when it's really not research and it's not evidence. It's more like seeking an experience and trying to find validation. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's just those things you have to distinguish between those two. So they sort of like, they want big science to validate them, but they don't want to play by the rules of big science, which is like, you've got to set your expectations, where it's like, if that's what you're aiming for, you have to be willing to abide by their value structure. Otherwise, just constant headache and heartache. So that's, I think, what I've seen like really grow over the last like 5 or 10 years, let's say.
Yeah, and that seems to be kind of step in step with kind of the rise of the internet and YouTube and all these other platforms that there's not really, I don't want to say checks and balances, but anyone can really say anything. So certain things take off and they kind of get a life of their own. I think that's something that a lot of researchers talk about, that we experience frequently in this community, of that sort of the new people getting in, and they'll say, oh, look at this photo from 10 years ago, the one that's already been debunked, disproven, it's been all over already. And they keep resurfacing time and time again. And that gives those of us that have been in it for a while a headache, of course, and kind of like, oh, here we go again. But it's one of those things that just seems to keep happening. It is just such an interesting sociological phenomenon in terms of, as I mentioned, not just people that are getting into it and seeing the kind of new things, but just everything that goes along with it. And as you mentioned, people kind of, I don't want to say the word echo chamber, but I guess that kind of is it, where, we're reinforcing each other's evidence or whatever experiences, let's say in some cases. And then you try to take it out there to another community or to somebody else and say, well, this is what I've had happen. And people are just kind of like, oh, okay. I mean, I've had that happen when I first got into it, playing wood knocks for people. Like, oh, I had this happen last night. Okay, so what it's a stick falling. It's like they don't understand the significance of it, but once you're in it, and that's something I feel as well, is you hear so many reports, you talk to so many eyewitnesses. It's like you have all this stuff that you've heard and you kind of are aware of, and then somebody from the outside, you talk to them and they just don't have that sort of basis. So it's almost very difficult to kind of get from where you're at to kind of speak, and it's like you can't understand each other. That's why I was sort of asking, how you would put to the layperson who was just getting into Bigfoot. Often people say, oh, you're into that Bigfoot stupidness. Like, oh, what does Bigfoot get around? Because there's only one of them, so it's just such a strange kind of position to find oneself in.
Yeah, I think you have to contend with those things. Well, I've had to contend with them, to some degree over time. But I sympathize with those people. I mean, I've had experiences myself, right? Like I've
Sure.
never seen one, but if I was being as honest as I could be, because it's easy for me to say like, oh yeah, I've heard them because I'm convinced that I have, but
Right.
because I can't prove that they exist, it's not very like responsible for me to say like, yes, I've heard Sasquatches, which
Sure.
I'm convinced that I have. But I will say I've had experiences that were consistent with the phenomenon as described by the testimonial claims,
Sure.
right? So I have sympathy for people that say like, I experienced this and I want to be taken seriously. Like those people that come to me with that, I definitely sympathize with that. So it's not a denigration on them at all. It's that if you take that experience and you impose it elsewhere and with the expectation that it will have the same value
Some sort of
as
weight to it.
exactly. And because we obviously believe in the concept of quality, that some things are of a higher quality than others, and you could apply that to evidence, and you could apply that to experience too. That's like I'm still searching for that. If they do exist, which I'm convinced that they do, but if they do exist, I want to have that unambiguous sighting, like unobstructed and favorable
Right.
lighting conditions. I've heard enough bumps in the night. I've heard enough vocalizations and rock throwing experiences and things like that. Like that's still not the quality, that I would hope
Right.
that would sort of like tip that scale for me. And even if I had that sighting, it's not like I could take that to the capital S science, the establishment, let's say, and expect that to have that same value. So I do sympathize with those people. But to your question about, like, well, how do you deal with the people on the other side? We have to make concessions. I mean,
Sure.
and when I was younger, it was really hard to do because I was just full of like the proverbial piss and vinegar. And like, I was sure I was right and pound my fist on the
Right.
table,
Right.
but it's like, no, there is no proof. There is no proof whatsoever. There's evidence, but it's only evidence when seen through certain lenses.
Yeah.
Like if you have no contact with information about, like certain things that related to, again, biology, ecology, physical anthropology, then of course, like you're not seeing what it is about this like physical thing, this
Sure.
element, this trace that makes it evident. So you have to make those concessions to people and say, yes, I am pursuing this because I think there's something to it, despite the fact that there is no proof. But I think if you walk into those conversations saying like the Sasquatch is real and I can prove it in a conversation, it's like you're defining your expectations poorly, because if you expect to win people over that way, like maybe it'll happen one out of every 200 times because you get someone who's
Right.
like sufficiently curious enough to go, yeah, like tell me more, and they'll do some research. But that's a big part of this too, is that like you had mentioned, every few years the same hoaxes resurface, not because of the hoaxers, but because someone unearths it and it makes the rounds again. And
They don't
there's
know better,
always,
so they're just like, oh, it's so interesting, let me share this with everybody in case they haven't seen
yeah,
it before. Right.
there's always been a high turnover rate in the Bigfoot thing. And I think a lot of that is mainly because people. I mean, even when I first got into it, I thought, oh yeah, this thing's going to be wrapped up in like 2 years, just because there is so much information, there is so much data that it seems like it's just that close to discovery or to recognition, and then you learn pretty quickly that it's just not.
Right.
And that we're still like, there's this massive gulf between pre-discovery and discovery. And also too, a lot of it just has to do with personal curiosity. Like you have no power over that which you're curious about,
Of course. Yeah.
like it just pulls at you, whether it's, who knows what it could be. But we've all learned, like if you try to make people curious about something, if they're not naturally curious, they won't care. And think about how
Yes.
many times your friends have tried to get you into something, like
It's not for me. Right.
a
Right.
book, a movie, a band, and you're just like, it's just not there. Well, I think a lot of people that get into the Sasquatch thing just have like a little bit of curiosity, and they satiate it really quickly, and then they just move on. Just like, I might be marginally interested in something and read about it for an hour on the internet and go, well, I know everything there is to know about that, and I move on and I never think about it again. And
Yeah.
so people do that with the Sasquatch thing too. So there's always going to be that sort of high turnover rate. But again, to the point of like, how do we have those conversations? Like, well, we make some concessions, but you also try to present enough data that they make a concession too, and say, oh, well, I didn't realize there was this much information, or that when seen through the proper lenses, there is this sort of compelling elements to certain bits of physical evidence, or like the temporal or historical context of certain stories and
Yeah.
claims and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of just sort of making good conversation, having open-minded conversation where you're willing to listen to the other person out, because I think especially nowadays, and this is maybe just a more broad societal problem, we're not able to really have conversations. People's attention spans are extremely shortened by social media and all the clickbait kind of stuff we're surrounded by. So you kind of get into a statement with an absolute, oh, I can tell you Sasquatch is real through a conversation. Then you start getting into slippery slopes, logical fallacies, all kinds of stuff, and nobody ends up getting their mind changed. People get angry at each other. I mean, this happens with politics. This happens with every single issue you can imagine daily to people. I think nowadays, maybe more than in the past, just because we've sort of lost that ability to do that. But something I do notice in the Bigfoot community is, which I think frustrates people, is that when you're talking to somebody on the outside and you talk about the different forms of evidence, there's the hairs, there's the footprints, all this kind of stuff. But it's almost like you have to view it as a whole to really appreciate some of what's there. And I think that gets lost on people that are maybe a little bit more on the outside. And I don't want to keep talking about, people on the outside. They're not, the end all be all at this, obviously, as you mentioned, science, but for a lot of people, this is a personal journey too. A lot of folks that have maybe had an experience that are trying to validate it, or just like myself, I've just been really curious in it. And, as you mentioned too, it's like, you'd love to just see one in that perfect condition. And will that ever happen? I mean, some people have researched their whole lives, and, some of the Four Horsemen, they never really had that privilege, I guess, and some people just drive on the road and happen to see something cross the road and want nothing to do with their story, and will only tell you when they trust you and never tell anybody else. So that's what I think kind of keeps myself going, and a lot of other people I've talked to as well. But no, absolutely. So fascinating. I do want to take some audience questions, though. I know people have been pouring some of those in, because I do want to talk about the NAWAC. So I think what we'll do is we have kind of a fun question here from Tactical Bigfoot Research. That's Mike. What is going on, man?
Hey, Mike.
Mike, yeah, he asks, what is Matt's favorite music to listen to when Bigfooting? Oh, that's kind of a fun question, yeah.
Well, it's funny because I've played music most of my life. I started playing in bars and clubs when I was 15 years old in rock bands, and then played like semi-professionally and then professionally for a while. I still play. So I listen to quite a bit of music, but usually, like, if I'm on the road these days, unfortunately, like, I mostly listen to podcasts. It makes the time go by a little bit faster for me than music does. So like, the longest times that I'm on the road to go bigfooting, like, usually I'm listening to podcasts on the way to or from. But in terms of like, we don't really play that much music in the field or anything like that. But I'm always torn between like the stuff that like, I'm a huge Beatles fan and a big Paul McCartney fan. He's probably my favorite songwriter, and all the things that sort of like came from that sort of musical DNA, so to speak. And then the stuff that I grew up on because I was a teenager in the 90s. And so all that 90s alternative rock radio. It's funny because like, I have a cover band here in Nashville, and that's what we play is 90s alternative rock. So we do like Stone Temple Pilots and Smashing Pumpkins and Weezer and, all that stuff. So usually for like rehearsing those songs and learning new ones, I'm listening to that stuff all the time. So it's like constantly being stuck in that feeling of like, just got your driver's license, 16 years old, driving across the North Georgia mountains, blasting 99X out of Atlanta, listening to Smashing Pumpkins at full blast. Like, I'll be 40 in a few months, and like, I'm still kind of doing that, driving across the mountains, listening to Smashing Pumpkins at full blast. So hopefully that answers your question there, Mike.
No, for sure.
I also met Mike. I met for the first time there at Squatchachusetts too. So.
Yeah, Mike is awesome. He is a great researcher, a good friend of the program as well. Yeah, that's one of those things. It's like, you just have that genre or that certain song that you'll be blasting. You're driving on those logging roads or whatever the case may be. You got to build yourself up and feel badass before you head out into the woods and kind of get to it. So that's always fun. But here's a question. I'll take this question from just a few minutes ago from Salvatore, who asks, what will it take to make the scientific community to say Bigfoot is a real cryptid other than a dead body? Is DNA enough?
As I understand it, a specimen will always be required at some point down the line. And that might change at some point. I mean, who knows? But the conversations that I've had over the years with scientists and wildlife professionals and academics too, has always been that sort of, we need a specimen. And so to like generalize that, I would say that the message that I've received over like the set of all of those interactions would be that acceptance will happen in the minimum necessary increments.
Right.
So, whatever it is that's produced, the needle budges only enough to accommodate that bit, to incorporate and accommodate that. So, like, for example, if we were to find a skull, and because more animals died in the past probably than are alive now, like, the likelihood is that skull's very old. And so, I've been told essentially, like, point blank, like, if you found a skull that was 150 years old, 200 years old, the first levels of acceptance, that minimal necessary movement, would be, well, there used to be some around, and apparently they survived until about 200 years ago, but there's no reason to think that there's any around now, and that these stories are just folk tales. It's modern folk tales and oral tradition left over from when people really used to encounter these things. Now, I don't know if that'd be the case if you found a skull that was 50 years old or 10 years old, something more recent.
Right.
That would be the case. And I think even if a specimen was collected, let's say that one is hit and killed by a vehicle on the Olympic Peninsula. I mean, you've been out there, what, like, that's like another planet, right?
It's like, and so, does it belong part of North America? It's like, that's how it's crazy. Yeah.
So you could imagine that the response might be, well, there's a small population that's restricted to this unique environment of the Olympic Peninsula, but there's no reason to think that they're in the Cascades or the Rockies or the Ozarks or the Ouachitas or the Appalachians or the Adirondacks, on and on and on. So it would be accepted somewhere regionally first as, like, representative of a very small population. And so what I would assume, what I've basically been told would be that something like, however a specimen is validated, whether that is, a diagnostic portion of one, like a big part of one that's maybe died naturally, or if it's the recovery of a whole specimen, that then now with eDNA technology, you could detect other populations through eDNA. So it's not like you'd need a specimen from every one of those mountain ranges that I just mentioned. Hopefully, like, that initial specimen would provide enough genetic material that then you could detect these other populations. But in terms of, like, outside of that, I just don't know. I mean, if that were possible, and those are conversations we have all the time in the NAWAC and with other academics and scientists outside of the NAWAC, is like, what if we did get a tremendous amount of environmental DNA? What would that do? And usually the response is like, well, then that would prompt an institution to gather the resources to go out and collect the specimen. Eventually, that, like, it seems like all roads lead to that event.
Yeah.
And so I do wish that there were some other method that was, like, readily available, but obviously, a piece of one is necessary. And so whether someone finds one that's naturally deceased, which may have already happened for all we know. I mean, in lieu of finding a skull, if you found, bones from a hand or a foot or something like that, you would have no idea what you were looking at, because they're so small. Like, a lay person wouldn't, like, if I was hiking through an environment and saw a collection of small bones, I wouldn't go, oh, maybe that's from, some unidentified animal, I should collect these. And most people would think to themselves, oh, it's an elk or a moose or a bear or a deer, and on and
something
on.
that makes sense, right?
Versus a skull that, if it was intact, that you'd go, what the, you'd know that there was something strange about that. So who knows? There might be bones somewhere in some collection. I think the people that are in the best position for that would be, well, I guess it gets into some other territory here about, like, places where developments occurred, like tracks from Bluff Creek, for example, because they were cutting a road into a fairly uninhabited area. Those sorts of things might have unearthed something like that might be in some private collection somewhere. But in terms of what it would take other than a specimen, I mean, I think that even if we fully sequence DNA, that eventually some institution would try to collect a specimen, even if the DNA was compelling enough. I mean, I would like to think that it'd be different than that, but who knows? I guess time will tell. Maybe DNA technology will get to the point that new species will be recognized wholly from DNA, because I don't think there's a precedent for that yet, as far as I understand. Now, things that are in the fossil record, like, Denisovans, well, the Denisovan is not really fully identified just by the DNA. They had these bone fragments that they knew were, characteristic of something different, and then were able to extract DNA. But it's not like there was just DNA in the environment, and they said, well, we detected this, so we're just going to announce that there was a whole different type of near human, et
Right,
cetera.
right.
So there's really not a precedent for DNA alone.
Yeah, and I mean that's something that's so interesting. I think about the bones a lot. People talk about that, and I thought about it especially this summer as we were driving through parts of Utah. I'd never really been to kind of that area of Colorado, Utah, Dinosaur Valley. There's the Dinosaur National Monument. That's probably one of the richest areas in North America where fossils have been discovered. And has there ever really been a sort of paleontologist that said, let's get a grant to go look for Bigfoot bones, or, where are the Bigfoot reports coming from? Those really acidic environments, right? But then you kind of bring in that Gigantopithecus question of, well, it's the largest ape supposedly in history that lived, and the only fragments we have are the some of the jawbone and those teeth and whatever, and how they were discovered in those Chinese apothecary shops. But I think, back to that kind of DNA/body, and I know a lot of people get hung up on that. People get very kind of invested in Sasquatch as the concept that they maybe have of it. And, we anthropomorphize Sasquatch, and we do that to every species, but I think Sasquatch, especially because it's eerily so similar to us, right? So I think people say, well, you can't kill one of these things because they're human, right? Oh, you guys are pro kill. That's really evil. But as you mentioned, I mean, sidestepping that's probably what the institutions would want to do. But it's something that's extraordinary claim, right? It's not just some maybe subspecies of a monkey in South America that they know there's 4 other variations that, okay, maybe some trail camera photos and some scant DNA evidence might be enough to prove that it's a species, right? It's something that would basically reinvent what we understand about apes, primates, all this kind of stuff. So that's just a very kind of interesting. I think people just get very hung up on that pro kill versus no kill kind of thing.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Gigantopithecus, because I still think that that's the best ancestral candidate that we have. And, I still think that that's the strongest hypothesis that's available to us. And so, using that, I mean, obviously, again, we have very limited remains of those, a handful of mandibles and about 1,000 teeth. And those are only in our possession because porcupines were dragging those into karst limestone openings. Most of those openings,
like the perfect setting for preservation.
Yeah, most of those openings weren't even there. Like certain sinkholes and caves weren't even open during the time that the apes were around. They were dragged in later. They were preserved to some degree. Or they sustained themselves in the environment, and then porcupines dragged them into those openings and consumed everything. And the only things that they couldn't consume were the very dense parts of the mandible and the thick enamel of the teeth. So there's these other factors there that sort of make you wonder, like, well, we have this idea of the distribution of Gigantopithecus, but it's really based on those 2 factors: karst topography and porcupines. And there's not karst everywhere in viable connected habitat, and there's not porcupines everywhere. And so they might have had a much broader habitat. So I think Gigantopithecus is important for the reason that, like you mentioned, I think in the eyes of a lot of people, it is an extraordinary claim. And there's that adage that, like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Sure.
Well, that depends on your definition of extraordinary. It's wholly dependent on that. If they are Gigantopithecus, or if they're, we know that this clade existed that produced multiple genera, undoubtedly, but there's 2 genera that we're aware of: Indopithecus and Gigantopithecus. It was once thought that they were one in the same genus. They used to all be lumped under Gigantopithecus, but now they've sort of been split. Indopithecus is about 8.6 million years old. That's Western Asia. So like the Patwar Plateau of Pakistan and the Siwalik Hills of India. Then you have Gigantopithecus, much like 2 million years ago till about 250,000 years ago or so. In China, there's a mandible from Indonesia, from Java, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, etc. So clade, we know of these 2 genera. A genus will produce a radiation of species, and so within each of these 2, like Indopithecus, we're only aware of 1 species. Gigantopithecus, we're only aware of 1. So they would have produced a whole host of different large apes, right? Some of which might have been more or less Sasquatch-like. So using that as a model, like for the extraordinary claim, it's like, well, I'm not even inventing a new ape. I'm pulling one from the fossil record, And we know that apes exist, and they distributed themselves across the world, including in North America, if you count Homo sapiens, which we are apes. That I'm only positing one new place for these apes, which would be the North American continent, because there are apes in Asia and in Africa, and then there were parts of Europe historically as well, or prehistorically rather. So I don't even think it's that extraordinary of a proposition to say that these apes that we know existed, that were already the right size, and that coexisted with Homo erectus for over 1,000,000 years. They had a co-occurrence there in these parts of Asia. So we know that our ancestors lived alongside something like this, and that many of their contemporaries, other animals in that faunal complex, came into North America during these time frames, that these things could have too. And so I understand, though, that like the Sasquatch to some degree does seem extraordinary enough that, unfortunately, yeah, it is different than saying like, oh, there's a new subspecies of flying squirrel or something of
Right.
that nature. So, but yeah, to the pro kill no kill point, like I do think because of the, probably also because of just the history of outlandish claims that have accumulated around this
Yeah.
subject, that it makes it much more of a difficult proposition for scientists to look into. It's been so taboo and so fringe for so long, that it probably would take something like a specimen. And the reality is that it's just a requirement. So again, I've said this a bunch of times, and so people might have heard me say it, and I apologize, but you know, there's a subset of people that say it's very sad and it's very ugly that science requires this, and that's true. I mean, that's
Sure.
wholeheartedly true. And then there's people that say that it's absolutely necessary, and that's also true. Like, both of these positions are true simultaneously. It is sad and it is ugly and it is necessary. And so it's an unfortunate reality. And hopefully, like, if people feel strongly enough that DNA could do it, then let's keep trying to collect DNA and have it rigorously tested and analyzed. But obviously it's a difficult and expensive proposition. And so, like, there's many ways that we could arrive at discovery, but I think it still seems like roads point to the collection of a specimen at some point in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we'll see if technology is able, as you said, that's always something that's evolving. We might get to a point where the DNA might be viable. But again, I think it's something that's just still, it's so hard for people to maybe wrap their minds around this. And this is something, people say, oh, there's sightings in all states and all Canadian provinces, except for Hawaii. And I think for the layperson, it's very difficult to accept the proposition that something like that could be living potentially in their wooded backyard, in a nature preserve or national park, going undetected. We would have had something by now. The classic kind of arguments. But
yeah. Well, it's the same thing about, there's two circular arguments I hear all the time. One of which is that eyewitness testimony is worthless.
Yeah.
And that it's not evidence, right? And then very often that same, like, hypothetical interlocutor will say, like, well, don't you think if they were real, like, people would see them? I mean, you've got this big giant ape running around, like, why does nobody? And it's like, well, which is it? You can't have both propositions, because people do claim to see them.
Right.
I think that the difficulty is that if you're looking at North America from like a bird's eye view of time and space, let's say, not just bird's eye view of space, but like over 250 years, then yeah, the map is like covered with sighting report dots. And so it's like they're seemingly everywhere, right? Like, they're all over the place. But if you zoom in to any one location at any one point in time, it's like they're impossibly rare.
Right.
They're completely unpredictable. They're just so exceedingly rare that, like, if you picked a certain drainage, let's say near you in the White Mountains, like, maybe someone's seen one in there in the last decade or the last 15 years, the last 20 years. And if you were to try to predict when the next sighting would be, well, good luck with that. So you zoom in on any location and it's like, yeah, it's pretty rare. But so I get there's that juxtaposition of like, wait a minute, so they're everywhere and yet they're nowhere. It's like, well, yeah, kind of. There's these paradoxes that happen depending on like what perspective you're looking at the phenomenon through. So I don't necessarily think that they occur in all the places that people think they occur. I think that that's sort of that nature and culture interplay where the cultural idea, there's plenty of people that once they get introduced to this idea, if they have like a robust interpretive schema of the natural world, and they start to try to
run amok with it.
Yeah, because the idea gets introduced, because a lot of your interpretation is based on novelty and the reduction of novelty. So if you've lived your whole life in the outdoors, there's very few things that are novel or new to you. And so when you have those sorts of people who say, oh, I saw something I've never seen before, or I heard something I've never heard before, you can investigate that. But
right.
If someone's grown up in like, in an urban setting, a suburban setting with no exposure to that. And then they get introduced to this idea. And now they're listening for it. They're paying attention to the world in a different way. And they're hearing night sounds for the first time, whether that's coyotes or the territorial dispute sounds of barred owls, and then there's like,
oh yeah,
Sasquatches everywhere,
Bigfoot on the brain. It's like they're priming themselves for having an experience, even though probably more than 9 times out of 10, what you're hearing is not Sasquatch related at all. But because it's something you're not familiar with, it becomes part of the Sasquatch narrative. Oh, it was definitely a Bigfoot. Nothing else it could have been.
Well, again, like we talked about earlier, projection into the unknown. Like when you make contact with the unknown, like it's like a void that you could project the contents of your psyche onto. And if that psyche's been preloaded with Bigfoot, because again, it's only unknown if it's novel. So the more that you read, research, investigate, spend time in the field, listen to animal sound, all the things that you could possibly contend with and expose yourself to, what you're really doing is you're reducing your capacity for novelty.
Sure.
So that when you go out in the world, all these things are recognizable, and none of them are novel and new. And so when something truly is novel, all of a sudden, like it's remarkable. We encounter novelty so rarely in the modern world, which is why I think so many people go out into nature and there's Bigfoot behind every tree, because like most of our lives are fairly predictable, and we encounter the same things over and over and over and over again. And then you put someone into a wild environment, especially like this. Most people go Bigfooting at night. And so it's like you stuck them in the environment and you put a blindfold on them, and now you're expecting them to imagine what might be out there, but to do it, responsibly. Like, yeah, good luck with that. It's like if you hear a strange noise outside your house, or like, if there's a thud in your basement, I challenge you to go down there and open that door with your eyes closed and stick your hand in there. Just see what your mind tells you is on the other side of that door. You'll think of all kinds of things. And so that's what people are doing. They're projecting that sort of fear into the unknown. And so I do wish, to your point about like, skeptics see like, oh, there's all these reports in all these states and provinces and everywhere. I don't think, that these things occur in all the places that people think that they do. And again, I think a lot of that is just coming from the general claims of people who are sort of like neophytes. And that's not a knock against them. I mean, it's not not a denigration or a castigation. That's just, I think that makes up a lot of the dots on that proverbial map, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that kind of, it's sort of cliche, but that it only takes one person to be telling the truth for it to sort of be a reality, right? And if you take out a lot of the stuff that's maybe misidentification or people with Bigfoot on the brain, right? Or a lot of times you see some of the stuff, for example, posting pictures of structures in a city park, probably Sasquatch sneaking around. I mean, go on YouTube and look up people that do primitive shelters, debris shelters, all this kind of stuff. That very common. I mean, it's a lot of fun to do those. It's actually something that people should go and practice. It's something kind of fun to do out there. But yeah, it's just such a tangled web at times, I think, when people are trying to kind of evaluate that. So I do think we need to look at it a little more rational. And I hope that through these conversations, we can at least kind of expose people to that idea of, well, hey, slow down here. Let's talk about what is and what isn't. Go out and learn the sounds of nature. The first time I ever heard a fisher, I don't know if you guys have them down in your area, fisher cats, some people call them. This is like a weasel-like thing. They produce this horrific screaming. It sounds like a woman crying, terrifying. I've had people in the past that have heard it and thought, oh my God, there's a woman being killed outside. We need to call the police. And no, it's an animal. So it's the more you learn about that stuff, the more you know about nature, the more, as you mentioned, when you get something novel that happens, oh, this was truly something unusual, something that can't be categorized. Absolutely. I mean, how many of those old vocalizations have kind of turned out to now be either some weird coyote noises that were like, oh, this was the best Bigfoot vocal, or something that turned out it actually wasn't, or some of the footage that's come out. I remember that one case that I think even Bobo kind of fell for it initially, was the moose photo out of one of those states out west. And it was like a really good looking Sasquatch, but it was kind of it was a rear end of a moose. And it was just that perfect angle. Or, recently, a couple of my buddies, Jonathan and Tate, they showed me this footage they got of a stump squatch that they kind of saw in the mountains. They're like, oh my God, that just looks perfect. And if you were to just see that at the right angle and say, oh, I definitely saw a Bigfoot, maybe that there's a percentage of that are in the sightings reports as well. But
yeah, I mean, again, I empathize with people and sympathize with them for for their pursuits, because I mean, obviously we're all like, personal discovery is like a continuum, you know. I mean, it's not like you're totally ignorant and then you have the truth or the wisdom, right? Like it's a path, it's a continuum, and you find yourself along it, right? And so everyone's at a different place in that. And so many people are just solely out to confirm the discovery for themselves, and there is nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely
and those
not.
people are going to have the most fun too, because then they set up the value structure.
Not as much disappointment, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, I'm still trying to do that too, to some degree. But also, obviously, I'm engaged in this endeavor to try to like demonstrate the reality of it, so hopefully simultaneously to myself and to, you know, the world, or to those aforementioned institutions. But even for, whether it's for people doing it like on their own trajectory for their own personal discovery, or if it is like as part of the community to contribute, or, you know, however they might see it. Like, I do think they have to not only reduce that novelty of the natural world, but like read the Sasquatch information, read all of it. You know, I've got this huge collection of, like, a big library of books. You know, there's a lot of good Sasquatch books. I think there's only about 5 that are like essential required reading. But, and it's funny because I there's a handful of those books I reread every single year. And it's like, well, the information doesn't change. Why do you reread it? It's like, yeah, well, the information doesn't change, but I do. I change every year, you know?
Right.
And so, like, you can encounter something that, like, it's because you were out in the field and you had a set of experiences or observations, or you met a new witness, or you exchanged ideas with other researchers. And then you read something that you've read 100 times. You're like, oh, wow, that was there. I never knew that was there, but that's so connected to this thing I just heard, et cetera. So it's really good to revisit that information, because you're constantly updating your own operating system. You know, if you're doing it right, you know, if you're constantly learning and, again, contending with those things and engaging the information. So going back and rereading those things. But the other value of that is, like, again, we talked about levels of quality. And so, again, to save yourself heartache, headache, et cetera, if you familiarize yourself, again, we go back to this proposition, there is no proof, right? There's evidence, but thus far there is no proof. So let's go to the classifications of evidence, and let's look at what is considered to be, from, you know, a scientific viewpoint, again, because we want to be validated by the big capital S scientific establishment. Well, let's look and see what things constitute the best evidence in their class, let's say, whether that's which hair fibers that have been analyzed the most closely, which tracks that show the certain foot morphology, et cetera, which vocalizations. And it's like, intimately familiarize yourself with that standard, that of that quality, and then realize, like, none of it is proof. None of it has moved the needle very far. And so if whatever you find is not exceeding that in quality, you should have no expectation whatsoever that it will make any difference.
Right.
And that's a liberating thing. Like, if I found tracks and cast them that were substandard to the best, most like detailed, high resolution tracks, of course, like, it would be a huge personal victory for me.
Yeah.
It'd be a validation of, like, oh, well, I think I'm in the right place because there seemed to be one of these things around. But knowing that, well, they're not as good as these tracks, and these tracks don't constitute proof. And so, like, why would I expect, you know? So a lot of it is really about, like, defining your expectations. What is it that you want? If you want to convince it, if you want to prove it to yourself, you get to make the rules. You'll have the best time. The second you want to prove it to another person, you're playing by their rules.
You have
and
to,
maybe they're like you and their bar is low, or maybe they're like you and their bar is a little higher, or maybe they're, you know, again, science, academia, the government, etc. And so it's best to, again, intimately familiar with the best evidence, and then understanding that, like, anything as good or lesser won't have any impact whatsoever, other than on yourself. And that's a liberating thing, because then you can collect things as you see fit, and you don't have to go through the headache and heartache of trying to impose those on other people, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and that's a big part of that sort of personal journey element of it too, is just
certainly
that so many of us are in it for that reason too. And yeah, there's just, man, we could really go on forever about this. And as New Hampshire Sasquatch says, Matt is the type of person you can listen to for hours. Man is an absolute gold mine of knowledge. Totally.
Very kind of you.
Now, there's a ton of questions about NAWAC. I promise I'll get to some of that, but I think this is a fantastic question from Jonathan, who asks, in becoming a well-rounded researcher, what would Matt say is the number one skill set to cultivate when it comes to Bigfoot?
That's a tough one, because I think the armchair research and field research have to be equivalent, in terms of like the amount of energy that you pour into them. I really do. And it can't be one or the other. And I know a lot of people who are one or the other. And I think that there's an element that they're missing from not having both. Sort of like I guess like a yin and yang kind of a thing, that they like the two sides make one whole unit. In that, there's a lot of people who are super dedicated, boots on the ground folks, some of which are great friends of mine who are incredible in the field, but they're like, look, I don't want to dive into that stuff. I'm trying to reach my own conclusions. I'm trying to, stay focused on what it is that I'm looking at. But then things that should be of significance sometimes get lost on them because they weren't aware that that was of significance, or they'll make contact with something in the field, like some phenomena that they associate with Sasquatch, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, has anyone ever reported this?" And you're like, "Yeah, people report that all the time, and they have for like 60 years." Oh, I thought I discovered something. Like, no, people experience that. So, and vice versa. There's people that are strictly armchair researchers who do a lot of reading and research, but I think that there is something about like embodying that, like living it and acting it out, going to those locations, let's say, and being in that environment and feeling what it's like to stand in that area or to be alone in that place. And it's sort of like you immediately more sympathetic to like what the witness claimed, because you're like,
Yeah.
Man, it would be terrifying to be here alone and see some imposing hulking animal, but also it gives you that when you go back again, you reread that information, well, you've changed because you've had that experience in being in those environments. And so I sometimes get tired of seeing researchers or proponents will often say, like, every time someone's skeptical, they're like, well, you know what? You just need to put on your boots and get out in the field and you'll feel differently. Come out. You don't never go out in the field. And it's like,
get off the computer, right?
It's kind of an unsophisticated argument, but there's some validity to it, because it really does change your perception of any of those given claims when you go to those environments, those places. If a claim, and you can rule out a lot of erroneous claims that way too, but obviously, you've been to the film site. I mean, it sort of changes things just to be there to like help you interpret it differently, know what it was like to stand there, know the route that it took to get there, even by vehicle and then on foot. So I do think the way to be I don't know that I'm a well-rounded researcher. That's what I'm aiming at. I'm trying to be. But I think it takes both. It's like that holistic sort of perspective of seeing duality and paradoxes. Not everything that's a duality is a paradox, but like seeing like the validity of armchair research and field research, and seeing like the potential biological origins, and then all those psychological, cultural productions, like being able to see or at least try to see the whole picture in like a holistic perspective is the key to everything. Everything has a cost and a benefit. You have to be able to see that. Every story, no matter how much you believe it, has the people, there's no human that's ever been immune to confirmation bias. We all are primed for that, and so just trying a holistic perspective, I think is the key to that. But the X factor to me is curiosity. So if you're insatiably curious, you'll read through. Nothing will be a chore to you. You will read everything you can get your hands on.
Yep.
You'll interview everyone you can speak with. You'll go to places despite, the weather or the conditions or the distance or, the gas money. Like
the dedication is there for sure.
Yeah. But it starts with curiosity. It's like, I have to know, I want to know, and it's like, there's no proxy for that.
I mean, us as a species, just look at how far, we've studied the world, and just the crazy lengths, people swimming across the Atlantic Ocean, all these things that people do. There's a drive there. There's a curiosity. There's what'll happen if I do this? What happens if we mix this and this? So I think that's just fundamentally just such a big part of the human spirit. So I hate when I see people kind of, denigrating others for just doing something they're passionate about. Everyone's got their own stuff they're into. So,
absolutely.
But that's a great answer. Also, I think a big thing is humility. Just personally, it's okay to be wrong. I think people nowadays are really afraid of being able to say, oh, I was totally wrong about this. Oh, I didn't know about this. I just think personally that's a great way just to grow as a person. And, I'm not saying that with a ton of experience or anything. That's just, I think, something that we could all get a little better at.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always appreciate kind words. Like I've got a pretty steel trap memory, and so I tend to retain things really well. And I always try to cite sources, especially when I give talks and presentations, because again, like a lot of the ideas that I'm championing came from John Green and Grover Krantz and these other
Sure.
people, and then other wildlife researchers, not even related to the Sasquatch, and I tend to retain these things. And so people will be like, very often people will attribute those things to me, and they're not my ideas. I'm championing the ideas of the giants whose shoulders I'm standing on. And
Right.
so there's an axiom, and I can't even remember where the source of it was, which is like, given this particular axiom, it's really bad that I don't remember where the source is, but it's essentially like, that there's a well of knowledge that everyone contributes to, all of us, humanity, our great mind. And the best any of us can try to do is be a good cup. But a cup must never confuse itself with the well. And I think that's a
Oh, that's
great
great.
philosophy. And since I'm trying to be a good cup, but I don't remember where that quote came from, I've sort of like failed in the endeavor. So there's some humility there.
No, that's a great analogy. I'm sure somebody will dig up the origins of that. But all right, I promised, guys, we'll get to the NAWAC stuff. There's a ton of questions about it, so I don't want to be here till 2 a.m, which I'm sure we easily could be if we had our way. But let's start with an easy one from Peggy, who asks, "When is the next episode of Apes Among Us dropping? I love that podcast. I've listened to each episode multiple times."
Oh, thank you, Peggy. Greatly appreciate that. Well, hopefully very soon. There's like 3 different ones in various levels of pre-production right now. There's another one that's going to be about another mystery ape on another continent. We
Sweet.
started this series that we were going to call Planet of the Mystery Apes, and I interviewed Gareth Paterson for that last spring. He was sort of the first entry there. And then there is going to be an episode about a recap of the 2021 summer operation, many segments of which have been recorded. Because a lot of those are these multi-segment recordings that are produced and put together like a radio program almost, that take quite a long time. And then Daryl and I are going to do another one-on-one episode. We're hoping to do more of these one-on-ones because we can put those out with more frequency. But Daryl is finishing his master's degree and building a new home and working full-time. And then I have essentially like 2.5 jobs. And so we're both like pretty busy, but I really appreciate you listening to that, Peggy. And so hopefully there will be 3 more episodes, at least 2 of them by the end of the year, I'm sure. So it's not as free, Bigfoot and Beyond we do every week. And that's, that's a hectic schedule to put out, because sometimes we record 4 of those in a single week. And that way we have some in the hopper to space out. But most of the time it's just like, hey, we got to put one out in like 3 days. Who do you got? And it's like in a frantic hurry, but
I can imagine, especially with those guys, events all the time and all over the place.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
It's even though we record remotely, like we still have to coordinate schedules, So it's like, it's not only hard to get everyone in the same room, but it's hard to get everyone in the same digital room sometimes,
Oh yeah. I get that too with the show, and because I'm specifically at a time too on a specific day. So it's been, I've had quite a few mishaps, and it's tough. So props to you, on top of everything else, being able to put all that together, doing your own show, and Cliff and Bobo's, and obviously bringing NAWAC people on. But speaking of that, moving on here, Jeremiah, this is a question he asked like an hour ago, so I apologize, I'm just getting to it now. But he says, Matt, what's the most freaked out you've been in Area X? And people love asking about Area X in general.
In terms of freaked out, I haven't really had that many like scary experiences in there. I'm trying to think, and I agree, Rebecca. A good library is definitely. I mean, the internet again.
Rebecca's awesome.
Cost and a benefit to everything. So there's a lot of benefit to the internet too, but there's a lot of cost. Anyway, in like Area X, well, there's a heck of a lot of snakes there, and where I grew up in Appalachia, I mean, we have rattlesnakes and copperheads and things, but you don't see them all that frequently. In fact, I just saw. I took Micah and Jeff from Sasquatch Tracks, the podcast, which I love those guys.
Yeah.
Great podcast and really, really good people. I took them out in North Georgia not too long ago and saw the first rattlesnake I've ever seen in Appalachia. And that's where I grew up there and been camping there since forever. And that's where I do the bulk of my field research. Whereas in Area X, I can see, like 10 or 12 snakes in a week. So sometimes that gets under your skin a little bit. Like once it gets in your head that like when you're propped up somewhere and sitting, and then you look and there's like some big massive snake very close by that you didn't realize was there. So, but nothing in terms of like anything Sasquatch related has been like terribly freak out. Well, some of the things that happened, like it's interesting because I think sometimes we go into, like, I've spent years pursuing this, and over those years, I've had a handful of these really compelling experiences that I'm convinced were Sasquatch related. Can I prove it?
Sure.
No. But were they consistent with the phenomenon? Absolutely. But then I've gone as long as like 4 years without hearing anything. And that's like diligently trying. There was one year when I had a fully funded project and I was in the field over 200 days and nights in a single year,
Oh,
and only
amazing.
had like 3 interesting nights out of that whole time. I mean, most of the time there's like nothing happened because, again, there was no novelty. Like, I recognized the sounds I was hearing, etc. But then there's things that happen, I think, that are so plain and obvious that you immediately assume that they're mundane. Um, it's almost like you're expecting something more dramatic. So there was one particular occasion I think we did talk about on Apes Among Us where um, there were 4 of us down there on a team. This was in 2018. It was right before Seth filmed that segment there.
Right.
The one that Seth filmed was on, I think, the 4th or 5th team, and my team was the first team. It was myself and Daryl and a guy named Ken Helmer and my friend Joel Thomas. And a long story short, this big heavy thing like walked away from me and Joel, and it was very, very close. And we both immediately assumed that it was our teammate Ken, to the point that like it didn't even shock or startle us until we heard Ken's voice from where he actually was, which was significantly far away. And wait a minute, that wasn't, and we kind of sprung
Right.
into action. So I've missed opportunities for reasons like that, it wasn't like some big dramatic boom, boom, thudding, menacing thing. One of the freakier things that I've heard there, 2 different times, that same team, I heard what sounded like a rock that, this was at night, it was in the dark. And there's a primary creek, and then there's a lot of channels of that creek that only rise up when there's a tremendous amount of rainfall and it floods. Most of the time they're just dry channels with water only in the primary creek, and those dry channels are just rocks. And we all heard something. It was captured on one of our autonomous recording units too. What sounded like a big rock, if I had to guess, it sounded like the size of like a fruit basket, impact and then move upstream like laterally for what sounded like 30 yards, like bam, 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 bam.
Wow.
Like it was like you threw a bowling ball up a lane. And again, like the valley floor is anywhere from like 700 to 1,000 feet wide at the widest points. And so and the slopes are fairly, gradual. They're not like steep cliffs. And so there's nothing like rolling down and the stream channels are in the center of that valley floor. And so like to hear some big heavy rock get hurtled in a direction that would have been upstream, that was pretty impressive. I've heard the big, what sounds like the sound that we heard last year, I've heard people describe it being like boulder tosses, but this sounded like if you took a metal dumpster and dropped it into the Rocky Creek bed from like 20 feet in the air. It was I don't know how anything could make a sound that loud. It was bizarre. And that was in broad daylight. Probably the most freaked out I've ever been is I was down there last year. It was just myself and one other person. And so we were just, trying to get footage and video, photographs and video, just the 2 of us down there. We had a larger team and a few people had to back out last year, obviously with the pandemic and the lockdowns, but he and I could still go. So we went, and a bunch of storms came through, and so trees were just coming down like left and right. I mean, you could wake up the next day and just hear trees coming down all day because there's the topsoils. It gets kind of loose because it's so rocky, and so you saturate that ground with enough water, and big heavy trees just give way, And then at night, one night, this huge tree fell near camp. And of course, we look with the thermal and there's nothing alive there. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. And like a day before, basically, we had to leave. We go walk that way. We realized like it's across the one and only road to get in there. And it was like, oh, man. And luckily, my friend Joel, on my way in there, he had said, hey, do you have a chainsaw? And I said, no, I don't. He said, I'm going to lend you mine. Like, you're going to want it. And if he didn't give us that, like,
wow,
we would have been down there I kept telling my buddy Scott was the other guy. And I was like, man, we would have been living out our days down there.
Once the supplies are running low.
Exactly. So that was a little freaky, but not for anything Sasquatch related. So sorry, Jeremiah, I don't have any crazy stories. Now, Mike would be the person to ask. Mike's, been in the organization for a long time. So when you have Mike Mays on, ask him that same question. He'll have a better answer than me for sure.
I know. I can't wait for that. And the problem is, like when I listen to him on Cliff and Bobo's show, and I've heard him on others as well, the big cat thing takes up a good portion of it. And I'm really into that too. I did a documentary about the mountain lions up here in New England, and I've talked to him about that, and I'm just really excited to talk to him just about that. But then there's the whole NAWAC aspect. But no, that I think just highlights the kind of the danger you can be sometimes in these remote places like that. People think, oh, the freakiest thing is going to be Sasquatch related, but might not even be. I mean, we were out in the PNW, with Connor Anderson when we were out in the Mount Hood area. The freakiest thing we had happen was running into those weird Satanists doing things out in the woods. Like that kind of stuff is often more freaky than the target subject, right? I don't know. At least that's kind of what it seems to be, and I think it just highlights the importance of staying safe out there. And good thing you had that chainsaw, right?
Yeah, thank you, Joel Thomas. Yeah, the most precarious situations I've been in the woods were because of other people. I've run into people only a handful of times that were like, this could get really bad.
Right.
So yeah, it's never been really animal related, thankfully.
Yep. Now here's a question from Tate, who asks, as a friend of Matthew Lowe, when Rob Lowe and his sons filmed the Lowe files with the NAWAC, did Matt get to work with them or on that production?
That was before my time. So that was filmed before I joined the NAWAC. So I didn't get to meet Rob Lowe. Many years ago, it's funny because I just showed some of the NAWC guys this. Like many years ago, I did a production with Cliff and Bobo and Moneymaker and Derek Randalls was there with Bob Saget.
Oh, I think I've seen that. Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. That was a really good time and pretty hilarious. It was funny because like all the funniest things that happened didn't make the episode. We kind of thought they were going to, but so no, I didn't get to. Not that Bob Saget's any less cool than Rob Lowe, but he kind of is less cool. So no, unfortunately, it would have been cool to hang out with Rob Lowe. I think that would have been cool. But Bob Saget was pretty cool too. So I'm not trying to knock the guy, but no, that was before my time, unfortunately.
No, fair enough. That's a good question. But Peggy asks, does the NAWAC accept new members who don't have much outdoor experience, perhaps for supporting roles?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we've got members in other countries, and there are members in other parts of North America that can't necessarily make it to Area X. And that is one of the things that we've been trying to focus on. That will probably be the crux of a couple of these new podcast episodes. It's sort of like expanding efforts into other parts of the continent and processing reports, processing data. Because, I mean, all of our eggs are sort of have been historically in the Area X basket, and for good reason too. But because the membership has grown and expanded, we wanted to put effort and focus some energy into some other areas of the country too. And so certainly, I mean, we've always taken members, but we've known that if a member applies from the UK, that's like, well, we're not going to be like, hey, we need your boots on the ground here. It's just not going to work out that way. And so certainly, there's a lot of people that support in terms of the dialogue, the brainstorming, the conversation, data processing, etc. So absolutely, Peggy.
Very cool. Yeah. So here's a good one from Ryan, who asks, Matt, what's some of the best evidence the NAWAC has collected to date?
Well, the bulk of the multimedia evidence collected has been in the form of audio. The organization for years, even back when they were the Texas Bigfoot Research Conservancy, the only real visual evidence that they pursued was via game cameras, like stationary game cameras. And so they ran a project called Operation Forest Vigil in 3 different areas, 2 in Texas and 1 in Oklahoma, Area X, with a series of mostly Reconyx cameras. That had its own kind of host of challenges. And so they sort of jettisoned that after, again, 5 years is a pretty long time to run a camera project. Sure. I'm sure like Derek Randalls and those guys can tell you, they've been doing it for a lot of years. It ain't easy.
Yeah.
And so then once the organization was more focused on specimen collection, then they sort of said, like, all these other things are secondary. Again, kind of like we talked about earlier about, once you're familiar with the quality of evidence, knowing that, like, well, this quality of evidence hasn't constituted proof, so why would we even chase it? Now I'm still chasing that stuff. Like, I want to find tracks, and I would cast tracks, and I'm very oriented on trying to get photographs and videos, etc. But they had sort of put all that on the back burner for a number of years. But we've spent more time and energy and resources on that. I would say specifically, probably mostly since 2018. So we've acquired new handheld thermal imagers, and we're probably going to acquire some more that are, the pulsar units are fantastic. Like those are really amazing units with all the capabilities and the like Bluetooth communication with devices, etc. They're really great. Obviously, we instituted a camera trap project that we called Hadrian's Wall that we're still experimenting with. And so that was implemented last summer. We've done basically 1.5 uploads of that so far. We've got to reattempt this second upload, but obviously no Sasquatch pictures yet. So there's no big reveal, unfortunately. As soon as if we get photographs, obviously we'd let you know. So only now are we really putting a lot of energy into trying to get visual evidence. So I would say of the best evidence collected thus far in terms of multimedia evidence, it would be audio. There is an episode of the podcast that we devoted to audio from the long duration recorders. It's called Soundscape X. I think we probably put that out in 2019. If you want to go back and revisit that episode of Apes Among Us. And then I was really impressed with the organization's radio telemetry data in that particular study. So if you go to the NAWAC's website, woodape.org.
There's a link to it in the description, folks, for those curious.
Perfect. Yeah. So you can go to the site via that link and then go to projects. And there's a lengthy paper and a podcast episode about this radio telemetry study that was implemented. And then one of the tags, these radio transmitter tags deployed. And there's a lot of compelling reason to think that it was something anomalous and not a known animal. I think that's really compelling evidence, but it's a little heady, it's a little cerebral.
Yeah.
Like it's not the kind of thing where you can just show someone. You have to read through it and explain the context.
You have to understand the full picture, sort of, too.
Yeah. So it's the most compelling thing would be an image. I mean, that's right. People are always hungrier for images than anything else. I mean, I remember when the Jacobs photos came out, which are obviously of some juvenile or subadult bear, but that's in a very awkward position.
Right.
So it looks, I mean, bears have very similar morphology to us. So they are very kind of primate-like in their structure. So it looks primate-like, right? And like that same year, there were a number of other compelling Bigfoot stories, including, this tantalizing DNA that Kurt Nelson had managed to process from the Snell Grove Lake sample. That story went nowhere, even though Monster Quest was broadcasting it. And these pictures of a bear at an awkward angle were like, that was one of the biggest Bigfoot stories ever worldwide.
Yeah.
And so it just goes to show you the value of images cannot be overstated. Images are really powerful. So we're putting a lot more effort and energy into trying to get visual data now. I know it's hard for people to swallow because they'll say like, oh, they've had all these experiences. Where are their pictures? But like, there really wasn't much of an effort to try to get pictures. And even those of us like, I don't carry a long gun. I'm not a collector. I'm sort of like I am trying to get some sort of evidence, but I'm more of like a spotter. So it's not like I have some big, SLR with a big, powerful zoom lens, like a real wildlife. I'm going to change that very soon. Like I would like to be equipped like a legitimate wildlife photographer, as amateur and unexperienced as I am at that sort of thing. Like usually, I've had some digital camera or camcorder. I'd prefer to be like more professionally outfitted, just to aim higher and try to get better photographs. But yeah, so sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No,
but I think that the best evidence thus far is probably in the form of audio.
Right on. There was a question about Hadrian's Wall a few times. I'm sorry to the person who asked it. It just, when they scroll up and I can't find them, it gets pretty difficult.
That's my fault because my answers run on too long so I apologize.
No, it's fine. People ask questions at random times and it'll be like an hour ago and it's just, I have to scroll back and kind of have to look for them. So it does get a little questionable. But here's a fresh question from Mike over at Tactical Bigfoot Research. He asks, what is Matt's favorite piece of equipment to use in the field?
Oh, that's easy. It's an iPhone. Hands down. 4K camera, 60 frames per second video, GPS, voice memos, which the microphone and like voice memos on these is very
not
good.
Bad, yeah.
And then I've got like the external like one of the Shure, I think it's the MV88, that it's a pretty good microphone that you can attach with that. So like topo maps, flashlight,
does it all.
Taking field notes, making video, like as soon as something happens, being able to note it or dictate voice memo, or if you hear a vocalization, record it. Again, so that and some extra battery packs. Like, I think that's one of the most invaluable tools. And devoid of that, obviously a really good pack. And other than that, I would say, like, in terms of like shelter, if you're backpacking, like I'm a hammock and rain fly or tarp kind of guy. If I'm doing a backcountry thing. So yeah, we all get like way into gear, right? Because we're nerds on that stuff, and you can get really like into cork sniffing about whose gear is neater and
The
cooler.
gear,
But
yeah.
I don't think like you can do better than a smartphone, because that's everything you need. It's a catch-22, right? Because then there is
You don't
that
want to
argument.
rely wholly on it, but it's still, there's some great stuff with it.
Yeah, but like, again, like topo maps and having GPS, because it doesn't require signal. So if you're in airplane mode, it still shows you real-time
Yep. Oh
GPS
yeah,
where you are and all
absolutely.
that.
I
But
use it hiking all the time that way.
I think there's an expectation that, you hear from the skeptical side, like, with all the proliferation of smartphones, why don't people have more photographs? And so I
Yep.
get it. There's still limitations in terms of, it's not the world's greatest camera or anything like
No.
that, but still 4K, and like the videos, 60 frames per second, if you set it to the highest setting. So it has a lot of potential. But yeah, I would say, like, if I had to carry one piece of gear out in the field, that would be it. And it's also like your emergency beacon if you have to call for help. Like, it's really everything. So I don't think there's any single thing. I've got like big shelves of gear and a couple of packs full of gear. Oh, snake boots. That's my second favorite piece of gear. Irish setter snake boots.
You guys
that
got
are
a
like
lot down that way.
knee high and waterproof. I don't even worry about the snakes as much as, like, I just love being able to march across like
Sure.
creeks and water and mud without getting, feet wet or it coming over the top of shoes. So those two things: iPhone and snake boots.
Fair
And
enough.
we're good to go.
Kevin Hamilton says I'd bring a 9-foot butterfly net.
Yeah, that sounds like a Mothman issue. Like you need a hardcore Lepidopterist to handle some giant 9-foot moth or butterfly.
There you go.
But
awesome.
I know what he
Yeah.
means for sure.
Yeah, Kevin's always he's always got some something in the comments to make us laugh. So that is that's a lot of fun. So I can't find the question anymore, but I'll just ask it. Any new updates kind of on Area X, how this past season went? I know you said 2020 was obviously, I think for everybody, was all messed up and all over the place, but 2021 rather, was it kind of more back to the usual sort of team kind of thing going on? Or
It was still smaller rosters overall, and I think a lot of it had to do, I work I'm a recruiter by day. And so I've done like executive staffing and search for about 5 years now. And, once the vaccines rolled out, the economy started like booming. Hiring is just through the roof. And so people are like, they're calling it the Great Resignation, because so many people are leaving their jobs and getting new job offers, et cetera. And so I think that impacted us too, because I think a lot of people went back to work or started new positions. So it's funny, like, and it's not by a large degree, but we had the overall numbers this year were a few lower than 2020 in our overall roster for the summer ops, which I wouldn't have anticipated. I would have thought the year of like the lockdowns or, the major pandemic year would have been lower, but it was this year. And I think mostly because people had work obligations or new opportunities. So we did a shorter operation. We did about 7 weeks instead of, we usually aim for like 15 weeks. But knowing that this would be a shorter year, so we want to have like a tighter focus, a little bit more a laser focus there. So some significant things happened, mostly with there was a team after the team that I was on that Daryl Collier was a part of. There were really no very significant visuals that, and I mean, no distinct visuals for sure, but I can't even think of like any partial visuals that come to mind. So it was a fairly quiet year in terms of sightings and things like that. But again, we were there shorter than usual, and so we'll see what happens in 2022. But yeah, we concluded the summer operation already, and are gearing up to do some things, not only in Area X over the wintertime, but in the next year, but also, like I said, expanding into other areas and looking into other things in terms of specifically trying to get visual evidence in other areas.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the one and only place that specimen collection would really even be attempted would be Area X. So everywhere else that we're looking at would be more of trying to get
much more visually oriented.
Take the tactics that seem to have led to observations and encounters there and try to use that to facilitate getting photos or video elsewhere in other places.
Right on. Now here's one I think some people will obviously like it, some people won't, but Stevie B asks, Matt, have you seen orbs in Area X? And if not, what is your opinion on orb sightings in general? And that's obviously something that kind of comes up a lot in these sorts of discussions. So I think it's fair to just kind of tack them head on.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I've never seen orbs. I don't think anyone's seen them in Area X, to my knowledge. I do think that that's a real phenomenon. And you know who knows quite a bit about that, in my opinion, is Micah Hanks, because he's studied the Brown Mountain
Lights. Yeah, right.
And I would butcher this if I wasn't a very good cup, and when he was explaining this to me. But it is some sort of like, the best hypotheses describe it as some sort of like geo-oriented phenomenon. Yeah. I don't know if it's like geomagnetic or if it has to do with like tectonic plate movements along fault lines, etc. But it does seem to be some very natural phenomenon that's earthbound, that occurs, rarely in like these certain specific places. And so I've met many people who've seen them, and I believe them. I just don't think that they're supernatural or metaphysical or anything of that nature. It seems to be like an anomalous and rare, but yet global, widespread. These kind of like ghost lights, let's say, or mystery lights, are seen in places around the world where there are no Sasquatches. And I know sometimes people want to connect those to Sasquatches, but it's like, why wouldn't we connect them to anything else? Why wouldn't we say that they're associated with possums or raccoons or deer or something that's even more numerous? But I would love to see them. I mean, honestly, I think it'd be really fascinating. There's a place in Washington where we spent a heck of a lot of time, sort of like on the south, trying to picture the map in my mind, the southeastern slopes of Rainier, basically like the foothills of Rainier there.
Beautiful spot.
And we spent a whole lot of time out there. And there's this one particular drainage. There's been this big road washout, like a huge culvert had washed out. So there's this massive gap in the road. So me and my buddy Tyler Bounds, that you might know, or if you haven't had him on the show, you should. He's a super cool
definitely. Dude. Yeah, I've heard a lot about him from Cliff and those guys.
He was my field partner for like the 3 years I lived in the Northwest. Like we did everything together out there. And we'd go back in this drainage because there was no vehicle access. And it was gorgeous and pretty wild back there. We would meet people all the time, not only back like in that general area, some fly fishermen or something like that, but people in Seattle that we'd get to talking about this place. And I always say, like, have you ever seen or heard anything strange there? Because I wouldn't always just come out and say, like, have you seen a Bigfoot? And like we heard some people would say, man, there are these lights back there. And people would talk about it so frequently. And there was one BFRO expedition. This must have been 2008 or 2009. Because I was on both of those, but there was one in particular where like 30 out of the 35 people there saw these lights, and they described them as like these basketball-sized things that would sort of just like meander, like hovering above the ground. And again, Rainier is a volcano. It's So, but and no one really had an interpretation of it that it was like metaphysical or supernatural. They're just like, well, there's some
what are these weird lights
happening just for like a night or two out of like the 5 nights we were there. It wasn't every night, but. So, I'm not dismissing the idea. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's associated with any animal or Sasquatch, but I would love to see it for sure.
Yeah, the world is such a mysterious place. I mean, the more we learn about that kind of stuff, I think, that typical kind of answering one mystery with another one, is that sort of the way to go. But I have heard that too, where people talk about, Bigfoot researchers saying, well, I see those things in my research area, but they're not necessarily saying it's Bigfoot related. They're just saying it's a weird light. And then, of course, there are the many who think that it's obviously Bigfoot related. But it's a fascinating kind of premise. And, I've seen weird lights in the sky, but nothing I could really say is like those kind of orbs that people describe as almost like going through the woods and
like at almost ground level and like, that sort of thing. It's fascinating. Again, I'd love to see it. I think it'd be really interesting to experience that. I don't know if there are people who study that. Micah would be a good person to ask. And I want to say that it was associated with fault lines and some sort of like tectonic movement. Yeah. I could be getting that wrong. So he would be the person to talk to.
The only thing that comes to mind is, the closest thing to it would be, I guess, swamp gas. That's what a lot of people would explain away the UFO phenomenon with, or St. Elmo's fire. I know that there's been similar stuff to the Brown Mountain lights up in the White Mountains. People saying they're seeing these things almost coming down off the mountain and floating around, and these kind of red lights or orange lights. So, it's super interesting. I think it's definitely if you're studying all other elements of the natural world, just another one to kind of tack onto it. But we'll take a few more questions here. I know there's a lot, and people have a lot to say, and obviously Matt has a ton to say, and we could listen to him all night. But Jonathan, what's up, buddy? He says, I joined late, maybe already talked about it, but can you touch on the correlations between tigers and what you've learned about supposed Sasquatch behavior? You talked about it, and then he thinks, I think it was you who spoke about it in detail in reference to a book. We haven't talked about it yet, so you're in luck.
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a host of things that sort of emerge when you're looking across the set of like all reliable Sasquatch sightings, right? When we gather these things up and we're looking for consistencies and sorts of like insights into behavior and ecology, certain things emerge time and time again. And a lot of it has to do with like these very furtive and elusive behaviors that I think most people interpret as somehow like a response to human pressure. You'll just hear that often, that people sort of assume that Sasquatches are always trying to hide from us, that it's specifically like to avoid human detection, et cetera. Then you have this subset of reports that, and there's some very credible, very reliable ones of them ambush hunting, whether it's deer, elk, wild pigs, whatever sort of like the large kind of dominant hooved animal in a given region is. And so these ambush predator tactics, I think, or these ambush predation behaviors are very interesting. And so when you read about other ambush hunters, and I think specifically tigers are sort of the most analogous, they live a very similar lifestyle. Now, a tiger is an obligate carnivore, so it only eats meat. Sasquatches, again, seem to be, based on the testimonial claims and certain physical evidence, omnivores. But even still, even if you are exploiting a range of foods, you can still be selected for a very specific kind of a thing. And so animals that are ambush hunters, by their nature, their lifestyle is dependent on being undetectable. Yeah. And so tigers, for example, live this very furtive, elusive lifestyle, and it has nothing to do with necessarily trying to avoid human detection. Although there are places, we've obviously had a terrible impact and like really driven the tiger to near extinction in some places, right. But they were behaving in these furtive ways even prior to our interference there. And that's because most of these animals that they hunt are herd animals. And so like when a tiger is basically trying to infiltrate a herd to make a kill, like it has to sneak past dozens of pairs of eyes and dozens of pairs of nostrils and dozens of pairs of ears. And so it can't be detected in any way, shape, or form. So there's a few good books about specifically Siberian tigers that, reading those, if you're super familiar with the Sasquatch, let's say like the canon of Sasquatch literature, reading this tiger stuff will be like almost like reading about Sasquatches.
Very complimentary, perhaps.
Yeah, well, just analogous sort of lifestyles and analogous behavioral repertoires, where it all of a sudden, the things that people think are impossible about the Sasquatch, which is like a hypothetical higher primate, which would have a very, powerful brain, we would think, well, it's not even improbable in this cat, this felid with, not a primate brain, but they're pretty damn smart. But there's one in particular called The Tiger by a guy named John Violent. And that's kind of a case study about one particular tiger that hunted down and killed a guy who wounded it. And so he tells the story of like the history of this region of Siberia through like a cultural lens. And he talks about the natural history of Siberian tigers all through the lens of like following the narrative of this one case. It's fascinating. It's a riveting book. But there's a couple of interesting insights in there that he describes, one of which is from a biologist that he interviewed who says, look, like prey live by a anywhere but there principle. Like they can be anywhere except where the predator is and they'll be fine. And there's a whole lot of anywhere, and there's only the one place where the predator is. Whereas a predator, it has to be exactly in the right place at the right time almost every time, or else it'll starve and it won't continue. And so they are entirely dependent on being undetectable, because if they're detected in any way, they'll never eat. Everything will always flee from them. And so in a tiger, you have this thing that's, 450 pounds for Siberian tigers, very big, very brightly colored. And they're very pungent, stinky animals. Like, yeah, they do groom themselves to some degree, but they give off a lot of smell. And so you've got this big, heavy, visible, stinky thing that has to make a living infiltrating groups of detection things. And also their prey is significantly intelligent enough. And those intelligences are manifested differently from prey to prey, that they have sort of different hunting strategies for deer than they do for wild pigs. And all tiger behavior is learned, hunting behaviors. So that's why, like, if a tiger female is poached and killed, those kittens essentially
They're
have to
just
be
helpless.
raised.
Wow.
Yeah, because they're not innate, which is fascinating. They have to learn these hunting techniques. They're not innate, hardwired, like baked in patterns of behavior instinctually. So you can read. There's another great book called the Great Soul of Siberia by a guy who was like sort of. We need him to decide to take up the Sasquatch cause because I think he was. His background was in literature, if I'm not mistaken, maybe journalism, but I want to say literature. I need to read his book again. But essentially, he was a Korean guy, South Korea, and was passionate about tigers and wanted to do field work in Siberia. When he got interested and started doing field work, there was less than 1 hour cumulatively of footage of Siberian tigers in the wild. And over like 15 years, this guy almost single-handedly got 1,000 hours of footage.
Amazing.
It's amazing. And so when you read these encounters and sightings, it's just like reading about Sasquatch encounters. The way that they behave and the way that they approach, and like everything about the Sasquatch that seems sort of like far-fetched and like, oh yeah, how convenient that an animal does all these things. And then you're like, well, tigers behave this way. And there's a really interesting passage where he'd put up like a series of game cameras all over this area to get footage of them. Because most of the time he was in these like little readout kind of bunkers that were very small and looking through this tiny window and filming through those. But he'd use game cameras too. And a lot of them had video capability so that you could hear sound as well, you know, and these cameras would be destroyed over and over and over again. And so he knew from the sounds on the video portions of the cameras that he could recover, as well as from like the bite marks and the claw marks, that they were tigers. And he describes in there how they were always attacked from behind and they were never approached from the front.
Amazing.
And in their destruction, he never. And so you hear that in the Bigfoot thing, like, oh, the Sasquatch always approach the cameras from behind and mess with it. And you think, oh, that's, you know,
very convenient, right?
But then you read that like tigers do this, and like it was multiple individuals too. There was a female that they were tracking that was doing this, and then I think a juvenile male. And so somehow they could detect these things in the environment, and they knew to approach from behind, from not like the facing side of it. However they interpreted that face or detected it, who knows? But he described that this was a consistent thing over time, over like at least a couple dozen cameras. So those two are great. And then Cy Montgomery wrote a book about tigers in the Sundarbans, which is in southeast India, if I'm not mistaken. It's coastal India, like in these tidal marshes. And that's like the tiger death capital of the world. They eat humans, you know.
Is that Man-Eaters of Kumaon?
That was Jim Corbett's book, and that book is.
Jonathan says, you know, thanks for the recommendation. Man-Eaters of Kumaon, or whoever you say.
Yeah, that book will scare the hell out of you. Anything by Jim Corbett about his hunting of man-eating tigers. He was the first tiger conservationist, so he was a good guy. But essentially, he would hunt down man-eaters, because once a tiger became a man-eater, essentially that's what they would pretty much solely go after.
What they had a taste for. Amazing. Wow.
There was one particular female tiger that he collected that single-handedly consumed 436 people. It's called the Champawat tiger. But no, this is a different area. There's an area in the Sundarbans where essentially like they think that because it's like tidal marsh and estuary, that the salinity of the water that gets into the freshwater promotes aggression. And so they think the tigers are a little more aggressive there. But that one is called, I got to pull it up because that's a fantastic one too, because she basically lives out there in that environment. That one's a lot about not only the natural history of the tigers there in India, but a lot about the people's beliefs, like the indigenous people's beliefs associated with their tigers.
Right.
And so that one I would highly recommend, if I could get it to load on my phone so I could give you the title of that one. That one is called The Spell of the Tiger. So yeah, Great Soul of Siberia, The Tiger, which is John Violent, The True Story of Vengeance and Survival, and then Cy Montgomery's Spell of the Tiger. You read those three, and I'll tell you, you'll look at the Bigfoot thing differently, and hopefully with like a new sort of biologically oriented perspective about what's possible in the animal world.
Yeah, that is just supremely fascinating. I mean, just with my own interest in mountain lions and having kind of really gained an appreciation for that species, tigers aren't that far of a step off. You've got fantastic stuff out of Africa too about lions. Obviously everyone knows about the man eaters of Savo and kind of those stories, but tigers are certainly a very fascinating species. So definitely check that out. I'm going to have to check some of those out, especially if you're kind of looking through that Bigfoot filter. I guess that will be supremely fascinating. So thank you for letting us know about some of that stuff. So I think we'll take one more question here from Salvatore, who asks, Matt, why don't we have a body yet? Do you think it's due to environmental conditions, community/government cover-up, or Bigfoot bury their own, or perhaps cannibal-like species?
Yeah, I don't think there's a government cover-up. I really don't. I think that the suppression always occurs at the individual level. So I think there are people in the government that have had encounters or observations, or they know someone who has. It's like any other set of people. Like if you were to ask, what do doctors think about Bigfoot? It's like, well, maybe some of them have seen one, and maybe some of them couldn't care less, and some of them are wildly interested, and some of them are totally cynical. And so I don't think, like, institutionally speaking, that there are any government institutions that cover it up. I think there are individuals who have encounters or observations, and they elect not to tell anyone about it for very good reasons. And those people might ascend those levels of strata in the government hierarchy and get to points of leadership. But again, I know very little about the UFO thing, but it's painfully obvious that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of whistleblowers from all aspects of the government, military, intelligence, you name it. There are tens of thousands of declassified documents, and there are, tens of thousands of leaked documents. Like, we don't have any of that for the Bigfoot thing. There's no whistleblowers. There's no, declassified documents, programs, etc. There's nothing that would indicate an institutional cover-up. So while the UFO people have a very valid scapegoat, to say, well, we will never know because they keep it from us. Like, I don't think we have that in Sasquatchery. Unfortunately, I wish we did. Then I could, like, take all this failure off my shoulders. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I've never seen one. I don't have, compelling evidence. I'm still pursuing this with, no physical evidence. I would love to have the scapegoat to say, like, I was this close, man, but the big government,
they swooped in.
That would be nice. I think the primary reasons are, A, nobody's looking for a body. And there's never been a legitimate concerted effort to look for either the remains of a deceased individual or, unearthing bones or something of that nature. There's never been an attempt for that, to aim at that. And so that's a big part of it. I don't think that there's enough people pursuing it in general to be impactful, even though it seems like everyone's out there looking for Bigfoot all the time. Like, that's just hardly the case. Most people are going out on weekends here and there. Most people are restricted in time and resources. So if you, again, like, bird's eye view of space and time, you look at, like, how many people are searching, like, legitimately searching for physical evidence. Now, again, most people are trying to have an experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. Most people want to hear one or see one, but you take, since the dawn of Bigfoot research in 1958 with, Tom Slick, et cetera, the Pacific, when people finally were pursuing them in the field until now, how many people have actually looked for physical evidence? It's very few. And over what percentage of North American viable habitat did they cover? Oh, probably 0.0000001%. So from that perspective, we haven't found a body or a part of one because no one's looking for it. Because again, like we talked about earlier, people might have walked right past a bone and not known what they were seeing, unless you saw a skull or an intact skeleton or an intact body with, hair and flesh still attached. Most of the time you wouldn't think it was anything significant. So I think the fact that they seem to be rare and that they prefer rugged, sort of dense terrain or dense forests in inaccessible terrain, and the fact that they probably live long lives, I think those things combined, it's like, be very rare to find a body, and then when no one's looking for one, those two factors combined. We don't have to invoke, like, a government conspiracy, and we don't have to invoke the fact that we don't have to invoke some hypothesis that they bury their own dead or eat each other, to come.
Do you think there might be any kind of validity to the kind of the burying thing? If because a lot of people, I think, nowadays are leaning towards away from the Gigantopithecus, right? More something not necessarily in the Homo genus, but somewhere in there, Paranthropus, all the different, all these discoveries that are going on now, whether it be Dragon Man or whatever, seem to be enthusing people about kind of that possibility. And, something to bring up Gareth Paterson, talking about the elephants, almost, they will bury, kind of not really bury, but sort of cover up their dead and human dead with some kind of significance. And only those two showing emotional intelligence and other kind of awareness. Do you think there's anything possible there, or is that just
I think it's possible that they could cover their dead, but I think they probably die alone.
Sure.
And in far-flung, you have
a lot of animals do
very large, and within that you have a territory which is pretty large, and then a core area is like the safest, most defensible part of that sure. home range or territory. And I think that's probably where they retreat to as they weaken and begin to tire and feel vulnerable, etc. And so they're probably alone in those times. Now again, I'm totally speculating here. It's possible, but Cliff is a fan of the Paranthropus hypothesis. We debate this on a nearly weekly basis. So maybe next time, because I know I'm probably going on much too long for your listeners, but I think Gigantopithecus is still the strongest contender for a lot. To make Paranthropus work, you have to build a much taller scaffolding than with Gigantopithecus. It doesn't require that many additional leaps or additions to what we know to sort of solve for the Sasquatch. But either way, I mean, I do think it's possible that they, cover their dead. Other animals do it. Again, you referenced elephants, and so now that's different than burying. Excavating earth and putting something in and covering it back up. That's more along the lines of us and our ancestors. But so it's certainly not impossible. But yeah, I don't even think we have to go there in order to solve for if these things are real, why is there no body yet? I think that's probably the main reason is there's not that many of them. They live long lives, so they don't die that often, and nobody's looking for them.
Yeah, how many institutions have said, here's a $10 million grant to go look for Bigfoot bones or Bigfoot bodies? I mean, aside from perhaps the few in the past, whether we're talking about Slick or Wally Hersom, that kind of stuff, that seems like that's not the everyday occurrence. And the biggest, I mean, aside from stuff that the NAWAC does, and I'm assuming other research groups, it's largely, members using their own gear, bringing their own stuff. A lot of the other sort of expeditions, if we can call it that, happen through TV and entertainment, right? They are the ones coughing up money. And is that always necessarily the most trustworthy of sources for this kind of stuff? I don't know. I mean, that's something I think is open for debate. But yeah.
Well, the other thing is how many bones? We did an episode about this not too long ago because one of our board members and a really great guy. He's another person you used to have on sometimes. A guy named Paul Bowman. One of my best buddies. I love the guy. He's a professional archaeologist, and his specialty is faunal remains, so animal remains. And so when he describes sort of the nature of what they do, it's it made me feel insignificantly stupid pretty quickly, because I realized even if I were to look for bones, what I would probably be doing is walking around hoping there's something laying on the surface.
Yeah.
And maybe you pick up some debris here and there and see what's under it. But in terms of if you were to grid out an area, why would you select that area? How big would you make your grid? How would you excavate it? Why that spot and not this spot? Wouldn't you look for certain deposits, fluvial deposits based on water action, or what do they call those, placer deposits, et cetera, things that are so far beyond me that it's oh, well, I just kind of assumed that if I encountered bones, it would be just sitting on the surface of all the debris, smiling at me, that I would see it from a distance and not actually have to get down on my hands and knees and dig and these sorts of things. So even when people say, oh, but there's people all over the woods, well, they probably don't drop dead where people walk. They're not dropping dead in campgrounds and trailheads and under a picnic table. But even if they were dropping dead sort of close to where people walk, well, how long is that sitting on the surface? Not that long before it's covered up. So there's a lot of reasons, I think.
Definitely. Very interesting. Thank you, Peggy, for that super chat. She says, thank you both for an amazing show. Thank you for taking my questions. Yeah, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you, Matt. I've learned a lot of new things. I think audience certainly has. Definitely check out those books you recommended, guys. That is such a great thing to just look into other animal behaviors. And again, that's kind of, I think that goes back to that sort of question about becoming a more rounded researcher. Even though we probably aren't going to encounter tigers any point in North America. I mean, I think Kevin Hamilton in the comments did say that Texas has the most tigers in the world, but that's not a naturally occurring thing. So unless you're in Texas and running into some place with exotic animals, Joe Exotic or something like that.
If you like to read relevant books, I would recommend that everyone read Ghost Grizzlies by David Paterson. And it's kind of an inquiry into the possibility that grizzlies survived in southern Colorado after they were supposedly extirpated. That's another good one. It's very relevant to the Sasquatch thing. So that one I would throw on the reading list too.
Yeah, I've heard even Forrest Galante talk about that in northern Mexico, and those mountains there are some of the kind of still reports of possible extinct or alive sort of grizzlies, which is again fascinating. I mean, that I think the stuff that Forrest does too is great in terms of it's much more in kind of the bona fide zoology realm, but very similar, a lot of overlaps. And he always says he's not a fan of cryptids or whatever. I know he was on Cliff and Bobo's show as well, but we should learn and try to listen to people like that as well, because it's at the end of the day, it just kind of helps us all out, I think.
I totally agree.
But yeah, Matt, it's been seriously awesome to have you on, man. I know the folks all really enjoyed it. Thanks to everyone in the comments and with your awesome questions, guys. I know there was a lot of questions about NAWAC. I wasn't able to get to some of them, so please bring them for next week. We're talking to Michael Mays, who is obviously also a member of the NAWAC. So we'll talk about probably some of the same stuff, and I imagine go into more details, but we may do a whole big cat section. So we'll be talking not tigers, but mystery cats. So that'll be more cat talk for sure. So thanks again, everyone. And if you guys are interested in the kind of stuff, please feel free to subscribe. Check out some of the previous shows. We've done quite a lot of interesting conversations. Hope to have Matt on at another point as well, maybe talk further down the road. But as I mentioned, next week will be Michael Mays. And this Sunday, it's not certain if it's going to be live or not, but probably will have that interview with Gareth Paterson up at some point, because I think he is super interesting. He's done work with lions in Africa as well as elephants. He has 2 books about kind of the secret elephants and beyond the secret elephants. So fascinating. And South Africa is just a treasure trove of the origins of humanity. So to know that there are still stories of man-like creatures there is very fascinating. So it'll definitely be on the radar for that, guys, but I will make an announcement about that. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you guys next week.